America likes its leaders polished, heroic, carved in stone or cast in bronze, ideally with a flag fluttering behind them and a bald eagle screaming overhead. But the truth, it's weirder. Presidents are not gods or saints or even particularly well-adjusted men. They are walking contradictions wrapped in outdated etiquette and bad haircuts. They're the nation's projection screen onto which we cast our myths, our fears, and, most disturbingly, our fetishes. Tonight we dim the lights and open the dusty drawer marked "Absolutely not in the textbooks." We're not here for policy. We're here for hemp, haunted monkeys, jelly beans, and death omens. Welcome to 2 hours of weird facts about U.S. presidents. And we begin appropriately with the man who's always first, even when we're trying to forget him, George Washington. George Washington is the closest thing America has to a secular saint. He's the marble man, the blueprint, the father of the nation. We picture him crossing the Delaware, sword gleaming, jaw clenched in stoic defiance. What we don't picture, George Washington hunched over a crop of hemp, muttering about a soil acidity. And yet, that's exactly what he was doing for much of his life. Out at Mount Vernon, his beloved plantation, Washington wasn't just growing corn and wheat. He was also growing hemp, lots of it. He even made special notes in his agricultural diaries about separating the male from the female plants. That detail, to modern eyes, has launched 1,000 conspiracy theories. Was Washington growing hemp for industrial rope and textiles? Absolutely. Was he also trying to boost the plant's THC levels for a little end-of-day relaxation? Probably not, but the folklore won't let it go. The idea of George Washington as a proto-stoner is admittedly hilarious. A man known for discipline, dignity, and dental disasters, lighting up a colonial joint beneath the cherry trees. That's too good to fact-check. It doesn't matter that the THC content of 18th century hemp was lower than your average lawn clipping, or that Washington was a bit too square for recreational drugs. The myth survives because it wants to. We want to believe that even the most buttoned-up founding father had a secret stash. It speaks to a deeper craving, the desire to humanize power, to imagine that even the men on our currency had vices, jokes, and possibly bongs. In the case of Washington, his legacy is too clean, so we dirty it up with folklore. We turn him into a meme, the father of the nation, and maybe the first guy to hotbox a barn. But if Washington was rigid, at least he had charisma. His successor had no such luck. John Adams was brilliant, loud, and about as cuddly as a tax audit. He didn't need drugs to reach altered states. He had cold water, lots of it, because while Washington may have farmed hemp, John Adams preferred to drown his sins. John Adams didn't believe in germs. He believed in water, freezing cold water, and he bathed in it daily, outside, in a river, stark naked, regardless of the weather. It wasn't hygiene, it was theology. Adams believed that immersing himself in ice-cold water was the ultimate physical and spiritual detox. Disease, purged by the chill, lust, frozen at the source, temptation, canceled via polar plunge. Every morning, while sane men sipped warm cider by the hearth, Adams would strip to his birthday suit and march defiantly into a New England stream. Some mornings, the water was barely liquid. That didn't matter. Purity, he believed, was measured in frostbite. This wasn't a passing phase. It was a decades-long ritual, part punishment, part exorcism, part deeply misguided health plan. The man who would later become the second president of the United States started every day by body-slamming mortality in the face. It worked for him. Sort of. Adams lived a long life, surviving into his 90s, sustained by a mix of stubbornness, self-righteousness, and probably mild hypothermia. But he wasn't just physically intense. He was emotionally volcanic. A brilliant lawyer, a political philosopher, a diplomatic pit bull, Adams was the kind of guy who'd start a shouting match with a fence post and write a 40-page rebuttal to its silence. He could insult you in Latin, argue in Greek, and then sulk about it in English. His letters are masterpieces of passive aggression. His diary reads like the personal blog of a man constantly disappointed that the world doesn't live up to his standards, which is to say, very online, 2 centuries early. And yet, beneath the fire and brimstone and icicle-based health trends, Adams was, dare we say it, soft. Not in temperament, but in craving. For connection, for admiration, for legacy. He wanted to be remembered, immortalized. Not just as a founding father, but as the founding mind. The man of principle, the architect of independence. Which is probably why it gnawed at him deeply, personally, that everyone liked Thomas Jefferson better. Jefferson, tall, suave, polymathic, dripping with Enlightenment charm. Jefferson had the brains and the aesthetics. He wrote with elegance, flirted in French, and served macaroni and cheese. Because while John Adams was braving frostbite for moral clarity, Thomas Jefferson was busy inventing pasta parties. Thomas Jefferson was a man of many contradictions. He wrote about freedom while owning hundreds of slaves. He preached simplicity while living like a European aristocrat. And when it came to food, he wasn't just a statesman, he was a snob. Specifically, a pasta snob. After a stint in France as America's ambassador, Jefferson came home with more than treaties and Enlightenment ideals. He brought back a taste for wine, fine art, and something far more revolutionary, macaroni. In Paris, he had become obsessed with the rich, cheesy, noodle-based dishes served by French and Italian chefs. And Jefferson, being Jefferson, didn't just want to eat mac and cheese, he wanted to engineer it. He designed a macaroni machine. He sketched it himself in classic Jeffersonian style, complete with cranks and rollers and the kind of precision usually reserved for scientific instruments or military cannons. This wasn't food, it was a culinary blueprint. Once back in America, Jefferson made macaroni and cheese a regular feature at Monticello dinners. He even served it at state dinners during his presidency, to the mild horror of other dignitaries who weren't quite sure what to make of a man so enamored with foreign pasta. In an age of salt pork and boiled cabbage, creamy elbow noodles were practically sorcery. To Jefferson, though, this wasn't decadence. It was philosophy. Cuisine, like architecture or governance, reflected taste, order, and refinement. Good food meant good society, and what better way to cultivate Republican virtue than by feeding your guests something they'd never forget. But again, Jefferson always lived on the edge of hypocrisy. The man who introduced America to macaroni and cheese also introduced sweeping contradictions. He saw himself as a farmer, but lived like a European noble. He claimed to hate political factionalism, but ran the most partisan administration the country had seen. He talked about moral clarity while having secret children with the enslaved woman he never freed. In a way, mac and cheese was the perfect metaphor for Jefferson. It looked simple. It was creamy, comfortable, approachable, but under the surface, imported ingredients, hidden complexities, a contradiction between what was served and who got to eat it. Jefferson could elevate something common into something elite. He turned noodles into national symbolism, just as he turned liberty into literature. But while his dinner parties were legendary, his politics often veiled quiet power grabs, backdoor maneuvering, and a healthy disdain for public accountability. Still, Americans loved him. They loved his handwriting, his intelligence, his strange little pasta obsession. He felt like the kind of president you could sit down with over a bottle of Bordeaux and end up arguing about Enlightenment ideals and wine pairings at 2 a.m. And as it turns out, the man who dined like an aristocrat had a friend who fought like a ghost. Because while Jefferson built machines for pasta, his successor once smuggled revolution in the hem of his coat. The next man on our list wasn't just a political theorist. He was a courier, a whisperer, a founding father by day, and a walking safehouse by night. Let's talk about James Madison, the man who literally wore his secrets. James Madison was 5'4", barely cleared 100 pounds, and had the posture of a stressed librarian. He looked like the wind could kill him, and very nearly did several times. But underestimate him and you'd end up outmaneuvered, outwritten, and, if you were a British officer during the Revolution, outwitted by a man literally sewing secrets into his underwear. Before he was the 4th president of the United States, Madison was a spy master's dream. Quiet, thoughtful, paranoid. He didn't just help write the Constitution. He lived like someone constantly expecting it to be revoked at gunpoint. During the Revolutionary War, Madison acted as a covert courier. The details are sketchy, partly because he was good at keeping them that way, but we know this. He regularly carried classified intelligence, encoded messages, and sensitive correspondence through hostile territory, hiding them in the least glamorous place imaginable, his own clothing. He wore secrets like armor, letters sewn into the lining of his coat, ciphers stuffed in waistcoat pockets, tiny scrolls wound into seams and cuffs. If TSA had existed in 1777, James Madison would have been a recurring nightmare. This wasn't theatrical paranoia, it was survival. If caught, Madison wouldn't have been fined. He would have been hanged, tortured, dragged through the mud, and made an example of. There were no Miranda rights, only the gallows and the British sense of vengeance. But Madison didn't flinch. Not because he was brave in the traditional musket-waving sense, but because he was obsessive. He believed in information, in precision, in control. He saw the revolution not as a military affair, but as a war of ideas. And ideas needed couriers. If it meant stuffing a declaration into his boot, he'd do it. If it meant pretending to be just another sickly Virginian aristocrat on a stroll, even better. That careful, calculated secrecy would follow him his whole life. Madison was the kind of man who could argue constitutional law for 14 hours and still find the energy to worry that someone was misfiling his correspondence. When he became president, he didn't stop distrusting people. He simply hired more of them to keep an eye on each other. But for all his meticulousness, Madison couldn't control time, because when he died, he left behind not just a country and a constitution, but a pattern, a strange one. 3 presidents died on July 4th, and Madison was almost the 4th. He lingered on his deathbed in June of 1836, barely conscious. His doctors knew the end was near, but some of his companions whispered maybe he could hold on just a little longer, just one more week. One more symbolic death to mark the nation's birthday. Madison didn't make it. He died on June 28th. History lost its symmetry by 6 days, but still. Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, all dying on the 4th of July. Coincidence? Cosmic joke? Or something the Founding Fathers knew that we didn't? Because our next president wasn't just part of that eerie trifecta. He was the 3rd to die on Independence Day. He survived revolutions, crossed battlefields, negotiated empires, and then, quietly, poetically, expired on America's birthday. Let's talk about James Monroe, the last of the Founding Fathers and the nation's final July 4th sacrifice. James Monroe, July 4th, 1831. Fireworks popped across the eastern seaboard. Brass bands wheezed through patriotic hymns. Speeches soared. Flags flapped. The United States turned 55, and people celebrated the way Americans always have, by congratulating themselves for surviving another year of themselves. But in New York City, on that same day, James Monroe was dying. Monroe had lived through almost every phase of America's infancy. He'd fought in the Revolutionary War, been wounded in battle, shared rations with George Washington, helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, and eventually served 2 terms as president. He was the last founding father to hold the office. The closer you looked, the more his resume read like a historical scavenger hunt. Governor of Virginia, diplomat to France, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, and President. And yet, in the end, his most enduring act was one of pure poetic timing. He died on the 4th of July, just like Jefferson, just like Adams. There's no rational explanation, no scientific reason. It's just weird. A man whose entire life was defined by service to the Republic decides, whether by cosmic design or absurd coincidence, to exit on the same date as his revolutionary brothers. It's as if they had all agreed tacitly to keep history tidy, to leave on the same page they'd helped write. Monroe wasn't supposed to outlive them. He was younger, yes, but not by much. Still, he held on for 5 more years after Jefferson and Adams died on July 4th, 1826. Maybe he felt lonely at the top, or maybe he knew the date was already spoken for and was just waiting his turn. It wasn't a quiet death. Monroe had been living in relative obscurity, plagued by chronic illness, massive debts, and the slow erosion of political memory. He was famous once. Then he wasn't. Like most presidents, history began to erase him while he was still alive. His final days were spent at his daughter's home in Manhattan. breathing heavily through the New York summer heat, his mind slipping between lucidity and the haze that often comes before the end. And then, on July 4th, 1831, he joined the ghostly Alumni Association of Presidents Who Die When the Nation Parties. 3 presidents, 1 date, 2 of them bitter political rivals, one of them Monroe, their ideological heir. It's not just eerie, it's operatic. A neat little narrative bow tied in red, white, and blood pressure. Historians have tried to brush it off as a curiosity, an anecdote, but let's be honest, this kind of timing makes you look over your shoulder. It makes you wonder if the Founding Fathers made one final pact, buried in the margins of the Constitution, where death is marked not by randomness, but by ritual. And if history was staging a cosmic joke, it needed a punchline, someone to stumble in next and shatter the symmetry, to show that presidents weren't gods, but something far funnier, which brings us to Monroe's son. No, not genetically, but spiritually. A man who didn't talk to stars metaphorically. He wanted to reach them. Let's talk about John Quincy Adams, philosopher, pugilist, astronomer, and the 19th century's most intense space nerd. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was not your average political heir. He was a child prodigy, a diplomatic wunderkind, and the only U.S. president to have actually been present at the birth of the country, watching, as a preteen, the Revolutionary War unfold from European embassies, while his father, John Adams, helped build a nation from ink and outrage. But while most political dynasties tend to decay into comfortable mediocrity, John Quincy evolved in the opposite direction. He got weirder. He spoke 7 languages, could translate classical Greek poetry before breakfast, and routinely took 4-mile swims in the Potomac River. Naked. If his father had ice water rituals, John Quincy had cold water chaos. But the thing that truly set him apart wasn't his brilliance, or his endurance, or even the fact that he later returned to Congress after being president like a boss in reverse. No, the strangest thing about John Quincy Adams was his obsession with space. Yes, space, as in the stars. In 1825, during his single awkward term as president, Adams stood before Congress and made a bold proposal. America should build a national observatory, not just any telescope shack. He wanted a grand, federally funded temple of astronomy, a place to study the heavens. A lighthouse in the sky, as he called it. Let's pause for a second. This was the 1820s. Trains were still experimental. The telegraph didn't exist. People were dying of bad milk and leeches. And here was the President of the United States saying, "You know what we need? A stargazing facility that rivals Europe's finest." He was laughed out of the chamber. Newspapers mocked him. Political enemies called it another ivory tower fantasy from the cold, cerebral Adams. Crazy Quincy, they whispered. Not just behind his back, but in print. But Adams didn't back down. He fought. He wrote long, impassioned defenses of space science decades before the word scientist was even a job title. To him, the stars were not distractions, they were destiny. And in a way, he was right. The Smithsonian, NASA, the Hubble telescope, all of it rests on the bones of one man's impossible dream. Adams once said, "Posterity, you will never know how much it has cost my generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make a good use of it." That quote gets passed around on the 4th of July. What they leave out is what he said next, that understanding the universe was just as important as understanding the Constitution. It's easy to dismiss Adams as an eccentric, but in hindsight, he was a time traveler, philosophically anyway. He wasn't just ahead of his time, he was out of sync with it, and like all people born too early, he paid the price. 1 term, constant ridicule, and a post-presidency spent fighting bitterly in Congress against slavery, ignorance, and the slow decay of American idealism. He died doing what he loved, arguing. In 1848, mid-debate on the House floor, he collapsed from a stroke. 2 days later, he was gone. His last words, "This is the last of Earth. I am content," spoken like a man who spent his life looking past Earth. But if Adams was too far ahead of his time, his successor was something much darker. He didn't look to the stars. He looked across a dueling ground. And when a man insulted his wife, Andrew Jackson didn't write a rebuttal. He didn't propose a bill. He walked 10 paces, turned, and ended the life. Time to meet America's most violent president, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson wasn't born in a log cabin. He was born in a vendetta. The 7th president of the United States didn't just believe in honor, he bled for it. His face was slashed by a British officer at 13. His lungs were scarred by tuberculosis. And his soul, that was carved into some ancient, haunted code of vengeance, duels, and divine punishment. If George Washington was the nation's father, Jackson was the angry uncle who drinks too much at Christmas and brings a flintlock to dinner. He fought in wars. He governed with fury. He stared down banks, Congress, and insurgents. But among all the many, many things Jackson did, none encapsulates the man quite like this. He once killed a man in a duel because that man insulted his wife. It happened in 1806. The target, Charles Dickinson, a young, hot-headed lawyer with a big mouth and bad instincts. He'd publicly accused Jackson of cheating on a horse bet, a serious accusation in the dueling South, but survivable. But then Dickinson crossed a line you didn't cross in Jackson's world. He insulted Rachel Jackson. Rachel had married Jackson thinking her divorce from her first husband was finalized. It wasn't. The scandal haunted them for years, and Dickinson dredged it up in public, suggesting loudly that Jackson had married another man's wife. That was it. Jackson issued the challenge. At dawn, the two men met in Kentucky, standing 24 feet apart, pistols in hand. Jackson, ever the tactician, let Dickinson shoot first. The bullet struck Jackson squarely in the chest, breaking ribs, lodging near his heart. But Jackson didn't flinch. He gritted his teeth, raised his pistol, took careful aim, and fired. Dickinson fell, bleeding, dying. Jackson walked away. The bullet that struck him was never removed. He lived with it in his body for the rest of his life. Just one of 2 dueling bullets permanently embedded in his chest, a kind of grotesque presidential souvenir. Jackson would go on to become a general, a senator, and eventually president. But that duel, that was the truest expression of his operating system. Loyalty, vengeance, and control, served cold and followed by breakfast. And here's the chilling part. This wasn't out of character. Jackson reportedly fought over 100 duels in his lifetime. Most were resolved without bloodshed, but some ended in violence. And the point was never just survival. It was dominance. You didn't cross Andrew Jackson and get a stern letter. You got a stare, a challenge, and possibly a tombstone. Even as president, the old code never left him. His enemies in Washington whispered about his volatility, his violent past, his scars. But the public, they adored him. Jackson was the first populist president, the first outsider, the first to ride public rage like a stallion into the White House. And he knew it. He embraced the chaos. He was the chaos. He ruled like a monarch. Spoil system. Indian Removal Act. Vetoes used like hammers. Every move he made came with the subtext. You don't get to question me. I've already been shot for less. But even Jackson couldn't duel the passage of time. His legacy is complicated, revered, reviled. He's on the $20 bill and simultaneously being removed from it. His memory, like his body, is a mass of wounds. Some self-inflicted, others gaping across the nation's conscience. Still, Jackson left behind something strangely contemporary. The idea that rage could be a strategy, that personal insult could become national politics. That power didn't have to be polite. It could be theatrical, petty, violent. But not all presidents brought pistols to the party. Some brought catchphrases, and one man, short, sharp, and oddly well-dressed, gave the world a word so sticky, so ubiquitous, that it ended up in every text message, every meme, every K. Cool. He didn't duel. He just said, okay. Let's talk about Martin Van Buren, the sideburn schemer who helped invent the first viral campaign slogan in American history. Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren didn't look like a president. He looked like a guy who owned a haunted antique store and only accepted payment in gold coins. Small, dapper, and alarmingly symmetrical. Van Buren had sideburns so expansive they should have had their own ZDIP code. But beneath the immaculately groomed exterior was a political animal so slick he made eels look clumsy. And he gave the world something it still hasn't stopped using. Okay. Yes, that okay. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of the 19th century version of a meme war. The year was 1840. Van Buren was running for re-election, and the opposition, led by the Whigs and their walking pneumonia mascot, William Henry Harrison, had him on the ropes. The economy was tanking. His enemies branded him as elitist and out of touch. So Van Buren's supporters went grassroots. They went weird. They leaned into his nickname, Old Kinderhook, a reference to his hometown of Kinderhook, New York. Suddenly the letters OK were everywhere, on banners, on buttons, on pamphlets. The slogan, Vote for OK, it was punchy. It was easy to remember. And it looked great painted on wagons pulled by barely sober volunteers shouting about Jacksonian democracy. But here's the twist. OK didn't start with Van Buren. It was already floating around in newspapers as a sarcastic abbreviation of all correct, a deliberately misspelled tongue-in-cheek way of saying all correct. It was part of a Boston fad, journalists coining absurd acronyms to mock the way ordinary people butchered spelling. Think of it as proto-meme culture, if meme culture involved way more top hats and passive-aggressive editorial columns. Van Buren's campaign didn't invent OK, but it weaponized it. It turned linguistic snark into political branding. And in doing so, they made OK the first truly viral word in American politics. Van Buren lost the election, but OK, that stuck. It embedded itself in the national bloodstream. It crossed borders, languages, generations. It showed up in Morse code, telegrams, typewriters, and eventually every digital screen we carry. OK became the verbal shrug of the modern world. A word that means nothing, everything, and whatever you need it to mean in the moment. And it all traces back to a little man with giant sideburns trying to spin electoral gold out of two simple letters. But Van Buren's legacy doesn't end there. His political instincts, sharp, scheming, unflinchingly strategic, laid the groundwork for modern campaign machinery. He was a founder of the Democratic Party, a master of the spoil system, and one of the first to treat elections not as lofty debates, but as ground wars fought with slogans, saloons, and printing presses. Still, history rarely thanks the operators. It remembers the dramatics, the grand gestures, the speeches that last too long and sometimes kill you. Because while Van Buren gave us OK, his successor gave us something even more American. The shortest presidency in history, cut down not by bullets, but by hubris and bad weather. Let's talk about William Henry Harrison, the man who talked himself into the grave. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison had one goal: to prove he wasn't old. That's how this all started. Not with policy, not with ideology, with insecurity. At 68, Harrison was the oldest man to ever run for president at the time, a relic of frontier wars and powdered wig nationalism. His opponents mocked him as frail, feeble, out of touch. So, on March 4th, 1841, he stood on the steps of the Capitol, stared into the gray teeth of a cold Washington wind, and declared war on mortality itself. He refused to wear a coat. He also refused to shorten his speech. And that speech was long, monumentally long, 8,445 words, nearly 2 hours, delivered without notes, outside, in the middle of winter. With the wind battering his lungs and the cold gnawing at his bones, he was trying to prove vigor. Instead, he proved perishable. Doctors would later debate what exactly killed him: pneumonia, typhoid, bad water. But what's clear is this: Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in history and then delivered the shortest presidency, 31 days. 1 month, a presidential shelf life shorter than most yogurt. It started with a cough, then chills, then fatigue. He tried to work through it. He held meetings from bed. His doctors bled him because of course they did. It was the 1840s and nothing says healing like draining vital fluids. He worsened fast. By April 4th, Harrison was dead. The country was shocked. The Whigs were horrified. And suddenly America was in uncharted waters. What happens when a president dies in office? There was no legal precedent, no constitutional clarity. Vice President John Tyler was sworn in, but critics dubbed him his accidency. Harrison barely had time to pick out curtains. Tyler would finish the term. Harrison's death was a punchline with a body count. It forced the country to take succession seriously. It left a generation of politicians terrified of rain clouds and overcompensating with scarves. And it cemented Harrison in presidential trivia hell. Forever remembered, never understood, because there's something deeply American about this story. A man trying to prove his strength by denying reality, rejecting a coat, talking too long, treating weather like an opponent. It was all theater, all image. And in the end, it killed him. But perhaps the cruelest irony, the man who died proving a point about youth and energy had once studied medicine. Yes, before he was a war hero, a governor, and a walking cautionary tale, William Henry Harrison nearly became a doctor. He studied under Benjamin Rush, one of the founding physicians of American medicine, until the lure of military glory pulled him away. In another life, Harrison could have cured people. Instead, he became the first president killed by his own speech. And his replacement? Well, let's just say John Tyler didn't catch a cold. He caught something else, 15 children to be exact. Because while Harrison died of exposure, Tyler made sure he'd never be forgotten by flooding the family tree. John Tyler. John Tyler should have been a historical footnote. He wasn't elected president. He was William Henry Harrison's vice president, thrown on the ticket to balance it out with some Southern charm and strict constitutionalism. When Harrison died just 31 days into his presidency, Tyler suddenly found himself leader of the free world. Cue panic. No one knew if the vice president was supposed to become president or just act like one until the next election. The Constitution was annoyingly vague, like a roommate agreement that didn't cover fire. Tyler solved the confusion by simply locking the door to the White House and refusing to leave. He took the oath, printed new stationery, moved in. Congress was not thrilled. But Tyler didn't care. He was too busy vetoing his own party's bills and making enemies like it was a competitive sport. They called him his accidency. Cabinet members resigned en masse. He was expelled from his own party. And still, he stayed. But here's where things go from constitutionally confusing to biologically astonishing. John Tyler had 15 children. Let that sink in. 15. 8 with his first wife, Letitia. 7 more with his second wife, Julia, who was 30 years his junior and whom he married while still in office. It was like a historical romance novel crossed with a Census Bureau report. Tyler holds the record for most children fathered by any U.S. president, but more shocking than the quantity is the timeline. Tyler was born in 1790. 1790. That's 1 year after the Constitution was ratified. And yet, brace yourself, his grandchildren were still alive in the 2020s. Not great-great-grandchildren. Not distant descendants, grandchildren. 2 of Tyler's sons, born when he was in his 60s, had children of their own in their 70s and 80s. It's the kind of math that makes your Ancestry app crash. A man born in the 18th century still had living bloodline echoes in the age of iPhones. John Tyler didn't just father children. He fathered time travel. His family tree isn't a diagram. It's a wormhole, a bridge between powdered wigs and virtual reality. He has more direct biological influence over modern America than most people realize. Every time a baby boomer complains about their Wi-Fi, they're only 2 generations removed from a guy who played the violin by candlelight and almost caused a civil war. Tyler's later years weren't much less weird. After leaving the presidency, he became the only former president to openly side with the Confederacy. He was elected to the Confederate Congress, but died before taking his seat. The U.S. government refused to fly the flag at half-mast. To this day, Tyler remains the only president considered a traitor by the country he once led. But traitor or not, he left something behind. An absurdly enduring, genetically overachieving legacy. And compared to his successor, John Tyler was practically understated, because the next president didn't just survive childhood disease and political warfare, he survived surgery without anesthesia at 17. Let's talk about James K. Polk, the teen who stared down agony and rose to power on nothing but raw, obsessive determination. James K. Polk. Before James K. Polk was the 11th president of the United States, before he expanded the American map like a kid with a coloring book, before he entered office vowing to do 4 things and actually did them, he was a teenager in unimaginable pain. 17 years old, rural Tennessee, a body racked with something no one fully understood. For years, Polk had suffered from severe abdominal agony, unexplained fatigue, and recurring illness. He missed most of his education. Some doctors diagnosed him with gallstones. Others just said, "He's frail." probably won't last. Medicine in the early 1800s was basically high-stakes guesswork with a bone saw. Eventually, a solution was proposed. Surgery. There was just one problem. This was before anesthesia. James K. Polk, teenage, sickly, hunched over from pain, agreed to undergo a gallstone removal surgery in 1812 with nothing to dull the agony but grit and prayer. Let's take a moment to appreciate the horror. This wasn't laparoscopic. There were no sterile gloves, no machines, no lights brighter than a window. The surgeon cut directly into Polk's abdomen. No chloroform, no ether, just scalpel, blood, screaming, and hope. And Polk, he survived. Not only that, he got stronger. After the operation, his health improved dramatically. It was as if the pain had been forged into steel. A quiet, driven steel that defined the rest of his life. Because James K. Polk didn't just endure pain, he weaponized it. He went on to college, graduated with honors, became a lawyer, then a congressman, then Speaker of the House, then Governor of Tennessee, and finally president. But that surgical table never left him. You can see it in every decision he made. Polk was ruthless, efficient, intolerant of nonsense. The man didn't drink, didn't dance, didn't smile unless it won him votes. His life had been carved down to purpose, and he made it everyone else's problem. When he took office in 1845, he told his cabinet he had 4 goals: settle the Oregon boundary with Britain, annex California and New Mexico from Mexico, lower tariffs, establish an independent treasury, 4 promises, 4 checkboxes, and he actually did them, all 4, in one term. And then he left, didn't run for re-election, didn't linger, just dropped the mic and walked off the stage, like a man who had already stared into the abyss, made it flinch, and saw no reason to overstay the applause. Polk's legacy is controversial. The Mexican-American War that followed his land grabs cost thousands of lives and fueled future tensions over slavery. But whether you love him or loathe him, there's no denying he did exactly what he said he would. And he did it with the cold, surgical precision of a man who once lay awake. Intestines opened, heart pounding, and still chose to live. He died just 3 months after leaving office. Exhausted? Spent. Some say the presidency killed him. Others say he never intended to survive it. His tombstone should have just read, "Mission accomplished." But if Polk was the embodiment of calculated purpose, his successor was something else entirely. Zachary Taylor didn't plan. He didn't promise. He barely voted. In fact, he didn't even cast a ballot in a presidential election until he voted for himself. Let's meet the general who stumbled into the White House like a man who forgot there was homework, then won the whole damn school. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was a man of dirt, sweat, and war. He spent 40 years in the U.S. Army, earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready, and commanded troops across 3 major wars. He was beloved by soldiers, feared by enemies, and perpetually confused by politics. The idea of voting? Alien to him? Speeches? He hated them. Campaigning? He thought it was improper. And yet, in 1848, Zachary Taylor was elected President of the United States. It's not that he didn't believe in democracy, he just didn't participate in it, not actively, not until the moment he put his own name on the ballot. Up to that point, Taylor had never voted in a presidential election. Not once. Not even as a casual civic hobby. He saw himself as a soldier, not a citizen leader. Voting, he thought, was something other people did. He was too busy commanding forts and fending off malaria. His first presidential vote for himself, and it worked. He didn't even belong to a party, at least not in the conventional sense. The Whigs picked him because they were desperate for a war hero to ride into office. He barely campaigned. Most of his supporters didn't even know his political views. He won based on his battlefield reputation and a few vague promises about unity, which meant everything and nothing. And when he took office, he kept the same attitude. Taylor didn't care for suits. He preferred rumpled clothes and muddy boots. He often refused to change outfits for formal events. Picture the commander-in-chief strolling into a state function, looking like he just came back from fixing a fence. He was the anti-aristocrat in an era of powdered formality. But here's the twist. For all his disinterest in politics, Taylor actually tried to do the right thing. He opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories acquired during the Mexican-American War. This made his Southern allies nervous, especially since Taylor was a Southern slave owner. But he wasn't ideological. He was pragmatic. He saw the coming storm and tried to steer clear of it. Spoiler, it didn't work. In July 1850, after just 16 months in office, Taylor attended a 4th of July event. The day was sweltering. He reportedly gorged himself on raw fruit, iced milk, and copious water, all probably contaminated because 1850s hygiene wasn't exactly rigorous. He became violently ill. Doctors tried the usual 19th century treatments, bleeding, blistering, and confusion. He only got worse. 5 days later, he died. The official cause was gastroenteritis. Unofficially, his death sparked conspiracy theories for decades. Poisoned by pro-slavery forces, foodborne bacteria, divine punishment for his lack of enthusiasm, no one really knows. His body was even exhumed in 1991 because of course it was. The test showed no signs of foul play. Just one more president who underestimated fruit. Taylor's legacy is as bizarre as his presidency. He didn't want the job, didn't plan for it, and barely lived long enough to leave a policy legacy. But in that short time, he tried to keep the country from collapsing. He failed, but the effort was real. Still, for all his rough pragmatism, Taylor's story is defined by its brevity. A military man handed a political puzzle he never wanted to solve, who died before he could even find the corners. But while Taylor stayed out of politics until the end, his successor was a man who wanted everything, even knowledge. Unfortunately, what he helped build would become the greatest irony of all. Let's talk about Millard Fillmore, founder of the first White House Library, who ended up joining a party dedicated to knowing absolutely nothing. Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore sounds like a joke name. A placeholder, a character in a Wes Anderson movie who collects butterflies and speaks in semicolons. And in many ways, he was just as weirdly decorative. A man born in a log cabin who rose to the highest office in the land, only to leave behind a legacy that reads like a slow-burning punchline about the dangers of political compromise. Let's start with the good. Because believe it or not, Fillmore was a guy who genuinely liked to read, grew up poor, educated himself, became a lawyer, climbed the social ladder not by family connections or battlefield valor, but by turning pages and absorbing facts. He believed in literacy, institutions, and knowledge as the backbone of democracy. When he became president, after the unexpected death of Zachary Taylor, Fillmore decided the White House needed something scholarly, so he helped create the first official White House library. He curated books, funded the effort, and made sure the executive mansion had a place for quiet contemplation amid the roaring chaos of 19th century politics. It was a noble move, civilizing even. The idea that the president should be more than a figurehead or warlord, that he should be a reader, a thinker, a man of letters. And then he joined the Know Nothing Party. Yes, that was their actual name. Though officially called the American Party, they were dubbed Know Nothings because members, when asked about their anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, ultra-nationalist agenda, would literally say, "I know nothing." It was secrecy meets denial meets raging xenophobia. Fillmore didn't create the party, but in 1856, he became its presidential nominee. The man who built the White House Library was now fronting a movement that proudly rejected nuance, complexity, and most flavors of Catholicism. It wasn't just ironic, it was tragicomic, like a chef campaigning for food poisoning, or a lighthouse keeper voting for the dark. Why did he do it? Well, after leaving the presidency in 1853, Fillmore watched the Whig Party collapse into useless factions. The country was fracturing. Immigration was rising. Fear was easy to sell. Fillmore, desperate for relevance and a political foothold, leaned into the wrong crowd. His campaign platform was simple: keep America for Americans, which in practice meant being suspicious of Irish Catholics, Germans, Italians, basically anyone who didn't speak English like a schoolmaster from upstate New York. He lost, badly. History mostly laughed him off, but the hypocrisy stuck. A man who once opened the White House to books had become the face of America's most proudly ignorant movement. And there's something uniquely American about that a president could be both librarian and demagogue, that enlightenment and paranoia could live inside the same body. that a single man could symbolize both the ideals of an informed electorate and the toxic panic that rises when knowledge meets fear. Millard Fillmore didn't leave behind a thrilling legacy. No wars, no massive scandals, no great speeches, just the library and the know-nothings. Shelves of books next to a locked cabinet labeled "Do Not Open," but at least he didn't run anyone over with a horse. Because that's where we're going next. Meet Franklin Pierce, a president so forgettable, most people can't remember his face, but who managed to get arrested while in office for running over a woman with his carriage. Yes, really, Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was handsome. Like, disturbingly handsome. The kind of face that looked sculpted for a romantic tragedy, or at least a CW drama set in 1853. He had a full head of dark, flowing hair, piercing eyes, and the sort of dashing presence that made people forget he was deeply, deeply sad. And often drunk. He was also the 14th president of the United States. Pierce came into office riding a wave of cautious optimism and slippery charm. A northerner with Southern sympathies, he was pitched as the man who could bridge the growing national divide. Instead, he became the political equivalent of a man pouring kerosene on a bonfire while smiling politely. But forget Kansas, Nebraska. Forget bleeding territories and broken compromises. Let's talk about the time President Franklin Pierce was arrested for running over a woman with his horse carriage. Yes, arrested while in office. It happened in 1853, just months into his presidency. Pierce was out driving his carriage through Washington, D.C., likely fast, likely distracted, possibly intoxicated. Reports vary because 19th century journalism operated somewhere between gossip and myth. But what's consistent is this. A woman was struck. She went down. Witnesses gasped. And Pierce kept going, not because he was fleeing necessarily. That's unclear, but the police caught up. Charges were filed. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. The sitting president of the United States was arrested for what would today be classified as a hit and run. Imagine the modern headlines. Imagine the memes. Imagine the 24-hour cable frenzy. But back then, things were flexible. Charges were quickly dropped. Insufficient evidence, they said. No trial, no explanation, no accountability, just a quick shove into the memory hole. The woman's name? Lost. Her condition? Unknown. The whole incident vanished like smoke, except for the lingering stench of impunity. Pierce was never really held responsible, which makes sense because Pierce never took responsibility for anything. His presidency was defined by moral evasiveness. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise and reopened the wound of slavery's expansion. The country bled, literally. Pierce shrugged. He called abolitionists troublemakers and enforced the Fugitive Slave Act with more enthusiasm than anyone expected from a man who claimed to be neutral. Behind the scenes, Pierce was spiraling. His personal life was a graveyard. His wife, Jane, was a shadow of a woman, paralyzed by grief after they lost all three of their children. One of them in a horrific train accident just weeks before Pierce's inauguration, with the boy crushed before their eyes. Jane never recovered. She believed the presidency was a curse from God. Franklin agreed, but he still took the oath, and then he drank. Pierce's drinking was an open secret. He reportedly kept a flask in his desk and once fell off his horse drunk in the middle of a campaign stop. When asked how he would handle being ex-president, he said, "There's nothing left but to get drunk." He did. Often. By the time he left office, his party had disowned him, his country had moved on, and even his legacy felt embarrassed to be associated with him. But that arrest? That quiet little scandal in the middle of his first year? That might be the most honest metaphor for his entire presidency. Pierce barreled through a fragile moment in American history, damaged people, and kept going. No apology, no real reckoning. Just a tidy dismissal and a presidency that became a footnote with blood on its shoes. And if Pierce was a symbol of damage without consequence, the next guy reveled in opulence during consequence. Because when the nation slid into economic crisis, President James Buchanan didn't tighten his belt. He popped a bottle of claret. James Buchanan. James Buchanan was the only U.S. president who never married, and based on how he governed, commitment wasn't really his thing. Tall, stiff, and notoriously indecisive, Buchanan had the vibe of a man who wrote thank you notes to his houseplants. He wore high collars, spoke in careful, overly formal prose, and often looked like he just smelled something slightly offensive in the Constitution. And yet, behind the grandfatherly exterior was a man who lived well, too well, because when the country collapsed, Buchanan threw a party. Let's rewind. The year was 1857. The economy was booming until suddenly it wasn't. Banks failed, businesses shuttered, railroads went bankrupt. The panic of 1857 rolled across the nation like an economic dust storm. Unemployment skyrocketed. Farmers starved. The American working class faced ruin. And Buchanan? He stocked his wine cellar. As the economy crumbled, Buchanan hoarded imported wines, mostly French, mostly expensive. Claret, port, sherry, anything aged, rare, or ostentatious. He threw extravagant dinners at the White House. Dozens of courses, imported delicacies, crates of wine brought in under the cover of night. To the people suffering outside, it was a message. You're not invited. The White House under Buchanan became a Versailles cosplay with worse lighting. Guests recalled lavish meals and endless toasts, all while factories closed and wages vanished. His presidency turned into a surreal play where Act 1 was champagne and Act 2 was civil war. And here's the kicker. Buchanan genuinely believed he was helping. He thought that by projecting confidence, by acting like nothing was wrong, he could calm the nation. It was the 19th century equivalent of buy the dip, except the dip was the economy, and the buyer was sipping vintage Bordeaux from crystal stemware while the markets choked on their own optimism. To be fair, Buchanan didn't cause the panic, but he absolutely refused to respond to it. He believed the federal government should do nothing. No intervention, no relief, no regulation. Just ride it out and let the invisible hand work its magic, even if it strangled everyone in the process. He made things worse by focusing obsessively on not being blamed for anything. Buchanan didn't lead. He deflected. When tensions between the North and South reached boiling point, he declared that while secession was illegal, doing anything to stop it was also illegal. In other words, somebody else fix it. He passed the buck so hard it left a crater in the desk. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office, 7 southern states had seceded. The Union was in flames. Buchanan handed over the keys and said essentially, "Good luck, kid," before slipping into retirement with his wine collection and a disturbingly clear conscience. Historians often rate Buchanan as the worst president in U.S. history, and not because he was evil, but because he was absent. He watched a country unravel and tried to out-cater it. He believed sincerely that good manners and fancy silverware could hold off civil war. They couldn't, and yet he was followed, almost mockingly, by a man who was the opposite of absent, a man who stepped into office knowing exactly what was coming, a man who dreamed about his own death and walked straight into it. Let's talk about Abraham Lincoln, the president who saw the end and didn't flinch. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is the closest thing American history has to a tragic Shakespearean hero. Tall, spectral, eloquent to the point of prophecy, he walked like a man who already knew the ending. And maybe he did, because Abraham Lincoln didn't just die a martyr, he dreamed it multiple times. The most haunting account came just days before his assassination in April 1865. He told it to his wife, Mary, and a few close friends. He said he had been wandering the White House alone in the dream. Everything was silent, the furniture draped in funeral black. He moved room to room, and everywhere he went, he felt a chill, a deep, invisible weight. Then he entered the East Room. Inside, a coffin. A soldier stood nearby. Lincoln in the dream asked him, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." That's the dream. And days later, it became reality. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. It was Good Friday. Lincoln died the next morning. The president who preserved the Union, abolished slavery, and gave the Gettysburg Address had foreseen his death with eerie precision. Not in some vague, symbolic way. A coffin in the East Room, a murdered president. Was it coincidence? A subconscious processing of endless death threats? Or something stranger? Because here's the thing. Lincoln had many premonitions. He told friends he believed he wouldn't survive his second term. He once claimed to have seen a double image of himself in a mirror. One face clear, the other pale. He interpreted it as an omen. One term bright, the other shadowed by death. He wasn't being theatrical. He was being honest. Lincoln, for all his wit and legal genius, was deeply haunted by war, by grief, by dreams. He often quoted Shakespeare, not the triumphant lines, but the bleak ones, the ghostly ones. He read the Bible like a man searching for a loophole in mortality, and the war itself, it mirrored his inner torment. Over 600,000 dead, brothers killing brothers, a country torn open at the seams, with Lincoln trying to stitch it back together using speeches and sorrow. He carried it all, in his eyes, in his stooped frame, in the silence between his jokes, and then, just as the war ended, boom, gone. Shot by an actor, in a theater, during a comedy. It doesn't get more cruelly symbolic than that. He became legend the moment he died, immortalized in marble, textbooks, and secondhand quotes, but the man behind the myth was someone who stared at death, not with fear, but with resignation, as if he knew he was just a piece of something larger, temporary, sacrificial. Lincoln's death wasn't just a national tragedy. It was the moment the country stopped pretending history had rules. He was killed in a moment of celebration, Victory Day. And yet it felt like defeat. A nation reunited, but not healed. A leader beloved, but not protected. He left behind a legacy built on impossible contradictions, freeing people while suspending habeas corpus, wielding power like a monarch to save a republic, dying at the height of triumph. And his successor, let's just say, the country went from a man of deep introspection and tragic vision to a guy who gave his inauguration speech while drunk. If Lincoln dreamt of death and turned it into poetry, Andrew Johnson slurred through history like it was a bad karaoke night. Andrew Johnson. Abraham Lincoln's assassination left the country shell-shocked, blood-stained, and leaderless. Into that yawning void stepped Andrew Johnson, a man who could have risen to the moment. Instead, he stumbled. Literally, Johnson's first act on the national stage as vice president was to get hammered. Not tipsy, not a little nervous. We're talking slurred speech, glassy-eyed, sweating in public, drunk. During his own inauguration, it was March 4th, 1865. Lincoln had just been re-elected, and the country was cautiously beginning to imagine peace after 4 years of civil war. Dignitaries, senators, foreign diplomats, and soldiers gathered for the inauguration, a rare moment of unity in a divided nation. Then came Andrew Johnson. He was sick, he claimed, or maybe hungover, or both. Either way, he downed several glasses of whiskey before taking the stage, supposedly as medicine. What followed was one of the most disastrous public performances in American political history. Johnson rambled. He shouted. He addressed individual cabinet members by name, awkwardly praising their service or demanding they remember who had appointed them. His voice cracked. His words sloshed out like spilled drinks. At one point, he tried to kiss the Bible. It was so bad. Lincoln reportedly turned to a colleague and whispered, "Do not let that man speak again." And that man was now next in line for the presidency. 6 weeks later, Lincoln was dead, and Andrew Johnson, our red-faced, whiskey-sweating vice president, was sworn in as the 17th president of the United States. It was an omen, a darkly comedic one. Johnson wasn't just a drunk. He was a political grenade with no pin, a Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union during the war, which made him a hero to some, but a pariah to most. He hated the Southern planter elite, but despised Black Americans even more. He once said the government was for white men. Not coded, not subtle, just violently clear. As president, Johnson did everything he could to undo the early progress of Reconstruction. He vetoed civil rights legislation. He opposed the 14th Amendment. He pardoned former Confederates en masse and allowed them to reclaim power in the South. It wasn't incompetence, it was sabotage, disguised as unity, and Congress noticed. In 1868, Johnson became the first U.S. president to be impeached. The House charged him with violating the Tenure of Office Act after he tried to fire Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. But the trial was really about everything else. His obstruction, his racism, his open contempt for Congress, and his drunken, unfiltered disregard for the responsibilities of the presidency. He survived removal by one vote. One. A single senator's change of heart kept Johnson in office, but his presidency was already finished in every meaningful way. A political ghost haunting the country he'd helped fracture again. By the time he left office in 1869, Johnson was universally despised. He didn't attend Ulysses S. Grant's inauguration. He didn't ride in the carriage with him. He just left, unmourned, unmissed. It's easy to joke about Johnson's drunken inauguration, but that slurred oath was more than a spectacle. It was a preview of a presidency defined by self-pity, sabotage, and one long sullen hangover from the hope Lincoln had ignited. But if Johnson drowned himself in whiskey and bitterness, the next man did something very different. He picked up a hammer and drove it, personally, into the last link of a railroad that would connect a fractured continent. Let's talk about Ulysses S. Grant, the general who won the war, and then nailed down the country's second transcontinental railroad. Ulysses S. Grant. By the time Ulysses S. Grant became president in 1869, he'd already lived through hell and come out the other side covered in gunpowder and grudging respect. He was the general who had crushed the Confederacy, accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and somehow managed to do it all while looking like he hadn't slept since 1861. But for a man known mostly for war, Grant's presidency was oddly constructive, literally. Because while his administration struggled with corruption scandals, patronage politics, and post-war chaos, Grant himself had his eye on something more permanent: infrastructure, connection, nation building through steel, and nothing symbolized that better than the railroads. At the time, America was still trying to stitch itself together. Politically, emotionally, and geographically, the Transcontinental Railroad had already linked the East Coast to the West by 1869. That was the big one. The Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah. History made. Hats thrown in the air. But there was a second one. A quieter one. Less photographed, more ambitious. The Northern Pacific Railway. It was longer, wilder, meaner. It snaked through the unforgiving northern frontier, Minnesota to the Pacific Ocean, cutting through mountains, forests, and lands still contested by indigenous nations and railroad tycoons alike. It was the transcontinental sequel with fewer cheerleaders and a much higher chance of frostbite. And in 1883, 8 years after he'd left office, Ulysses S. Grant personally drove the final spike. Let's pause on that. Most former presidents retire into memoirs, yacht clubs, and lucrative silence. Not Grant. He took a train to Montana, grabbed a hammer, and slammed the ceremonial spike into the last stretch of track with the same resolve he'd used at Vicksburg. No speechwriters, no fanfare, just steel meeting steel. He wasn't there for glory. He was there because it mattered, because Grant, for all his reputation as a taciturn soldier, believed in connection, in nationhood, in physical symbols of unity. The Northern Pacific was more than just a railroad. It was a scar across the wilderness that said, this still belongs to all of us. And maybe, on some level, Grant was trying to nail his own legacy into place. His presidency had been rocked by scandal, none directly tied to him, but enough to stain the administration. He'd been too trusting, too loyal to grifters. He wasn't a politician. He never pretended to be. And Washington ate him alive for it. So instead of rewriting history with words, he used action. He traveled, he wrote, he finished his memoirs while dying of cancer, writing through excruciating pain so his family wouldn't be left penniless. He rebuilt his honor not through spin, but through labor. And that spike, that was the punctuation, a clang of finality, a literal act of progress, one war hero. One hammer, one last unspoken promise that, even after blood and betrayal, America could still be stitched together, mile by agonizing mile. But while Grant left his mark in cold steel, the next president left his mark in something a little more retrograde. Because while Grant hammered railroads into the wilderness, Rutherford B. Hayes was refusing to even pick up the telephone. Yes, really. The first president with access to a working telephone thought it was too undignified to use. Rutherford B. Hayes. If Ulysses S. Grant hammered a steel spike into America's future, Rutherford B. Hayes politely declined to pick up the phone, literally. Hayes was the 19th president of the United States, a Civil War veteran, a reform-minded Republican, and the man who technically ended Reconstruction. But despite holding office during a time of immense political change and technological possibility, Hayes will forever be remembered for one hilariously petty act of Luddite snobbery. He was the first president with a telephone in the White House, and he refused to use it. Let's rewind to 1877. Alexander Graham Bell had just invented the telephone the year before. It was a marvel, a revolution, the 19th century's version of AE. Suddenly, you could transmit your voice across cities, over wires, without screaming or hiring a courier with strong calves. Bell was eager to show it off. And where better than the executive mansion? So he personally installed a telephone line connecting the White House to the Treasury Department, approximately a 10-minute walk apart. The White House got its very own number, 1. That's it, just 1. Because sometimes irony writes itself. Hayes was impressed by the idea of the phone, but not the sound of it. The early model was scratchy, staticky, full of ghostly echoes. Hayes reportedly tried it once, grimaced, and declared it undignified. Undignified. Let that word linger. Not inconvenient. Not confusing. He didn't call it noisy or unreliable. He said it was beneath the office. The President of the United States, Commander of Armies, Protector of the Constitution, was too classy for a phone call. So the line sat there. It buzzed. It rang, and Hayes mostly ignored it. Meanwhile, the rest of the country was falling in love with the future. The telephone spread across businesses, cities, and homes. It changed everything: commerce, diplomacy, human relationships, but not Rutherford B. Hayes. To him, speaking over wires was like yelling into a soup can tied to a kite. He preferred handwritten notes, formal audiences, letters sealed with wax and condescension. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about aesthetic, and the telephone to him was a parlor trick for impatient people. There's something strangely relatable in that, because Hayes wasn't dumb. Far from it. He was an intellectual, well-read, and forward-thinking in many ways. He supported education for Black Americans, civil service reform, and even advocated for women's rights before it was fashionable. But the phone? Too weird, too intimate, too casual. And that's the paradox of progress. Some people fight it, not because they hate the future, but because they're embarrassed by how it sounds. Hayes wasn't wrong that early telephones were awkward. He just failed to see what came next. And so, while Bell's invention would go on to shape every century after his own, Hayes drifted back into historical obscurity. His voice never captured by the technology he helped install, and then promptly ghosted. But his successor? Let's just say he didn't avoid attention, because James A. Garfield was a walking contradiction. A preacher turned professor turned president, a man who could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the same time, and still couldn't dodge the bullet waiting for him 6 months into office. James A. Garfield might be the smartest president you've never thought about. He was a professor at 26, a Civil War general by 30, a congressman for nearly 2 decades, fluent in Greek and Latin, not just conversationally, but ambidextrously. The famous story goes that Garfield could write Greek with one hand while writing Latin with the other, simultaneously. Was it a parlor trick? Probably. Was it impressive? Definitely. Was it useful for running a nation? Not at all. But Garfield didn't need gimmicks to prove his brain worked at an uncomfortable speed. He was a philosopher-politician hybrid, the kind of man who quoted ancient texts to make budgetary points, and once wrote an 80-page mathematical proof just for fun. He didn't run for the presidency so much as back into it. In 1880, he attended the Republican National Convention as a supporter of another candidate. He gave a rousing speech. Impromptu, eloquent, electric. The crowd went wild. Delegates shifted, and suddenly they nominated him. Garfield didn't even want the job. He accepted the nomination in stunned disbelief, like someone who walked into the wrong room and was handed a crown. Still, when the moment came, he didn't flinch. He won the presidency, narrowly, and started what could have been one of the most promising administrations in U.S. history, but it lasted only 199 days. Because on July 2nd, 1881, James Garfield walked into a Washington train station. He was preparing for a vacation, maybe the first real break of his presidency. His secretary, Blaine, walked beside him. The sun was out. The air hung heavy with heat and politics. Then came the sound. 2 gunshots. The shooter was Charles Guiteau. a deranged office seeker who believed God had chosen him to kill the president. His motive? Garfield had refused to give him a diplomatic post. So, naturally, Guiteau brought a .44 British Bulldog revolver and rewrote the course of history. Garfield didn't die immediately. He fell to the floor, bleeding but conscious. Doctors rushed to his side, and that's where the second tragedy began, because Garfield might have survived the shooting if it weren't for the doctors. In 1881, American medicine was still suspicious of things like germs and washing hands. One physician probed the bullet wound with unsterilized fingers, introducing bacteria that caused massive infection. For weeks, Garfield suffered. He wasted away in bed. His weight dropped. Abscesses formed. Pus drained. The bullet wasn't what killed him. Incompetence was. He died on September 19th, 1881. His presidency was over before it had even begun. But his death sparked something rare in American politics. Actual overdue reform. Public outrage over Garfield's assassination and the patronage system that enabled Guiteau's madness led to the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which began the process of ending the corrupt spoils system. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. An echo of Garfield's quiet promise to make government respectable again. He became a martyr for merit, a fallen intellect, a reminder that brains aren't bulletproof. But Garfield's legacy, like his talents, often goes unnoticed. He had the mind of a philosopher king and the fate of a footnote. He didn't live long enough to be great, but he was, perhaps, one of the greatest presidents in potential that America ever lost. And the man who succeeded him, he had no illusions of genius. He preferred style over soul. Let's talk about Chester A. Arthur, the man who turned the White House into a personal runway and ordered custom suits like they were executive orders. Chester A. Arthur. When James Garfield died, most Americans weren't just grieving. They were also panicking, because next in line was Chester A. Arthur. And Chester A. Arthur was not known for his moral fiber. Before becoming vice president, Arthur had been deeply entrenched in New York's political machine, the infamous patronage network known as the spoils system. He was appointed collector of the Port of New York, one of the most lucrative political gigs in the country, largely because he was loyal to the right, corrupt people. And when reformers tried to clean up the swamp, Arthur was the guy still splashing around in it. So when Garfield died and Arthur became president, reformers shuddered. Here was a man known less for leadership and more for lapels. The jokes came fast. A dandy in office, more interested in collars than the Constitution. Can't lead the country, but boy, can he lead a cufflink. And to be fair, Arthur really was into fashion. He reportedly owned over 60 custom-made suits. He changed outfits multiple times a day. His morning coat was not his evening coat. His top hat had rivals. Even his pajamas were probably embroidered. He imported the finest European fabrics. He had tailors on speed dial. Well, metaphorically. And the White House, under Arthur, began to feel more like a private gentleman's club than a seat of government. But then, something strange happened. Arthur changed. Not just his wardrobe, his character. Instead of doubling down on corruption and cronyism, he did something few expected. He embraced reform. He backed the very legislation designed to dismantle the spoils system that had made his career, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It was a political heel turn so sharp, people assumed it had to be a trick, but it wasn't. Arthur genuinely supported merit-based appointments, professional standards, and the idea that maybe the federal government shouldn't be run like a social club for party loyalists. It was the makeover no one saw coming. Critics called him the gentleman president. And for once, it wasn't an insult. He modernized the Navy. He vetoed pork barrel spending. He told corrupt allies to take a hike. He even ordered extensive renovations of the White House, but not to show off, just to fix the actual rot. And then, just as he was beginning to build a real legacy, he walked away. Arthur had Bright's disease, a debilitating kidney illness he kept mostly secret. He chose not to run for re-election, quietly, dignified, stylish to the end. He died less than 2 years after leaving office. His tombstone bears no mention of his presidency, which is somehow fitting. Chester A. Arthur is proof that people can surprise you, that a man obsessed with cuff width and silk vests can rise to meet a moment and do it with grace. But if Arthur ruled with a mirror and a conscience, the next man brought baggage, specifically one illegitimate child, a massive sex scandal, and a campaign slogan so snarky it could have been written on Twitter. Let's talk about Grover Cleveland, twice president, once accused of abandoning a baby, and forever haunted by a chant that went, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland holds one unique spot in American presidential history. He's the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, making him both the 22nd and 24th president. 2 inaugurations, 2 separate administrations, 1 very large mustache. But before any of that happened, before the speeches, the vetoes, or the panic over tariffs, Cleveland was just a Democratic candidate with a problem, a very small one, a baby. In 1884, just as Cleveland was emerging as the Democratic nominee, a story broke in a Buffalo newspaper that Cleveland had, years earlier, fathered a child out of wedlock with a woman named Maria Halpin. According to the report, Cleveland had not only refused to marry her, but had also had her committed to an asylum, and the child placed in an orphanage. It was tabloid gold, scandal, sex, institutional abuse, and a potential president right in the middle of it. Now here's where things get murky. Cleveland didn't deny knowing Maria Halpin. In fact, he admitted the child might be his, but also suggested that Halpin had been romantically involved with multiple men at the time, including several of Cleveland's own friends. His defense was basically, yes, there was a baby. It might be mine, but then again, it might be Steve's. This was 1884. Victorian morality. Public figures fell for far less. But Cleveland's blunt, weirdly stoic honesty worked. His team spun it as an example of personal responsibility, a painful moment from his past that he handled like a man. Newspapers sympathetic to his campaign painted Halpin as unstable. The GOP, meanwhile, pounced. Their slogan, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" It was chanted at rallies, scrawled on placards, used in editorials. The Republican Party believed they had struck gold, a ready-made scandal that made Cleveland look like a predator wrapped in presidential ambition. But then Cleveland won, and the Democrats responded to the chant with a savage punchline. "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." That's American politics in a nutshell. Cleveland's presidency turned out to be surprisingly principled, if a little dry. He was a fiscal conservative, a veto-happy minimalist, and one of the few presidents who seemed to genuinely hate being in power. He believed in small government, gold-backed currency, and not giving people jobs just because they voted for you. But the baby never quite went away. Years later, the child, named Oscar Folsom Cleveland, grew up knowing the rumors, living under a cloud of political shame no one could entirely explain. Maria Halpin's life was never the same. She gave interviews, was scrutinized by a scandal-hungry press, and was ultimately discarded by the very system that had used her to generate outrage. Grover Cleveland, meanwhile, went on to win again after losing in 1888, a political comeback no one expected. But his personal legacy was always tinged with that one scandal, that one chant, that one story America never stopped whispering. In a strange way, it made him more human, more flawed, more real. He was a man who made a mistake, tried to contain it, and then got elected twice anyway. A public Puritan with a private past that didn't match. And that dissonance, it only got weirder with his successor. Because while Cleveland's scandal involved an unwed mother and a possibly orphaned child, Benjamin Harrison had a more familial twist. He married his dead wife's niece, and his kids never spoke to him again. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was the kind of man who looked like he was born at age 50. Bearded, serious, deeply Presbyterian. He was the grandson of President William Henry Harrison, the guy who talked himself into pneumonia after a 2-hour inauguration speech. Unlike his grandfather, Benjamin survived his own presidency, but just barely held on to his family in the process. Let's rewind. Harrison's presidency, 1889 to 1893, was one of tariffs, expanding pensions, and the introduction of electricity to the White House. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act into law, beefed up the Navy, and added 6 states to the Union. But none of that is what people remember about him. They remember the Nice marriage. After his wife Caroline died of tuberculosis in 1892, Benjamin was devastated. Understandably so, they had been married for nearly 40 years. She had been First Lady. They had children together. He adored her. He even refused to campaign for re-election as she lay dying in the White House, losing to his old rival Grover Cleveland who returned like a mustachioed ghost. But then 3 years later, Harrison got remarried to Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, his late wife's niece. To clarify, this wasn't some distant cousin twice removed. This was his deceased wife's blood relative. Mary was 25 years younger than Benjamin, closer in age to his children than to him. She had lived with the Harrisons as a kind of companion helper during Caroline's final years. And then 3 years after the funeral, she became Caroline's replacement. The wedding, held in 1896, was quiet, private, which was a good idea because it tore the family apart. Harrison's adult children were horrified. To them, it was a betrayal, not just of their mother's memory, but of familial boundaries and Victorian propriety. They considered it grotesque. They refused to attend the wedding. They cut off contact with their father. One of his daughters never spoke to him again. Even in an era when marriages to younger women were common among older widowers, this crossed a line, because this wasn't just about age. It was about placement. Mary wasn't some socialite Harrison met at a ball. She'd been in the house, at the deathbed, holding Caroline's hand, and now she was taking her place. The public reaction was mixed. Some newspapers whispered. Others politely looked away. But the damage inside the Harrison family was irreversible. Benjamin and Mary had one child together, Elizabeth. She was born when Harrison was 63. He doted on her, but she would grow up never really knowing her half-siblings. The family tree had split into factions, awkward branches never to be reconciled. Harrison died in 1901 of pneumonia, the same illness that had taken his grandfather, though with far less theatrical flair. His second wife outlived him by nearly 47 years. His children did not attend his funeral. It's one of those stories that history textbooks politely skip because it doesn't fit the narrative. Presidents are supposed to age into dignified grandfathers, not awkward romantic plot twists from a Bronte novel. But Benjamin Harrison's personal life reminds us presidents are people. Messy, grieving, lonely people, and sometimes grief rewires the rules, or breaks them completely. If nothing else, Harrison proves one eternal truth. Just because you can marry your wife's niece doesn't mean you should. But if Harrison scandalized his family, his successor brought something far more wholesome to the presidential toolkit, an uncanny photographic memory, specifically for faces. Let's talk about William McKinley, a man who could recognize you years later after a single handshake, and possibly never forget you. William McKinley didn't look like a man with a superpower. He looked like a high school principal with a firm handshake policy and a collection of waistcoats. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't radical. He was steady, well-mannered, and as traditionally presidential as a late 1800s man in a frock coat could be. But behind that calm exterior lurked something uncanny. He never forgot a face, not in the charming, "Hey, I remember you from that fundraiser" way. We're talking years later in crowded rooms with dim lighting and zero context. McKinley could spot someone he'd once met briefly and not only remember their face, but their name, their occupation, their political concerns, and sometimes even what they had been wearing the last time they met. He had, quite literally, a walking facial recognition system. This wasn't a party trick, it was how he governed. McKinley used his memory to forge personal connections. He'd shake someone's hand once, at a rally, a train station, a state fair, and 3 years later, he'd greet them by name in front of a stunned crowd. Voters remembered that. They felt remembered. It was the ultimate political magic trick, the ability to make thousands of people feel individually important. In an age before mass media saturation, this mattered. McKinley wasn't charismatic in the theatrical sense. He didn't deliver barn-burning speeches or shout down his enemies, but he radiated warmth. His recall wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. He paid attention, he listened, and he remembered. That in turn made him one of the most quietly effective politicians in American history. His presidency, 1897 to 1901, oversaw major events: the Spanish-American War, the annexation of Hawaii, the Gold Standard Act. He modernized the U.S. economy, expanded American influence, and presided over a country beginning to flex its imperial muscles. But it was his personal style, his radical niceness, that left the deepest impression. He was unfailingly polite, even to his opponents. He didn't give many speeches, preferring to meet people one-on-one. His front porch campaign in 1896 involved him staying home while thousands of visitors came to see him. He stood, smiled, shook hands, and remembered them. It was charming, it was eerie, and it probably got him elected. But that same openness would be his undoing, because McKinley's trusting nature made him a soft target. He refused extra security at public events. He believed in shaking hands until his palm went numb. That's how he died. In September 1901, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley was doing what he always did, standing in a receiving line, greeting strangers, smiling, remembering. One of those strangers was Leon Czolgosz, a disillusioned anarchist with a pistol hidden under a handkerchief. McKinley extended his hand. Czolgosz fired twice. The crowd tackled the assassin. McKinley, ever composed, told them not to hurt him. He didn't know what he was doing, he said, bleeding from a bullet wound that would prove fatal 8 days later. It was an assassination born from trust, from that open posture, from that human memory that never suspected betrayal in a handshake. His death shocked the nation. He'd been liked, genuinely. His successor, Theodore Roosevelt, brought energy and fire, but McKinley had brought grace and this quiet, strange ability to make everyone feel like they mattered. In the age before data, before social media, before everything was recorded, William McKinley remembered you. That was his weapon, his charm, his downfall. And speaking of weapons, his successor didn't just survive an assassin's bullet. He ignored it, shrugged it off, and gave a full-length speech with a slug of lead in his chest. It's time for the human freight train of American masculinity. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was not a subtle man. He was the human version of a cavalry charge. Loud, kinetic, and completely disinterested in your opinion. He boxed. He hunted. He wrote 35 books. He gave speeches with the fervor of a preacher, possessed by the ghost of American exceptionalism. He once said, "I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life." Then he got shot and proved it wasn't just a slogan. It was 1912. Roosevelt was no longer president. He served 2 terms, left office voluntarily, and then, like a man incapable of watching someone else drive, decided to come back. The Republican Party had moved on, so Roosevelt formed his own, the Progressive Party, aka the Bull Moose Party. Why Bull Moose? Because when asked how he felt, Roosevelt said, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." That was the vibe, not strategy, not subtlety, just antlers and testosterone. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was in Milwaukee, preparing to deliver a campaign speech. As he stepped into his car, a man approached, quiet, composed, armed. Bang. A bullet struck Roosevelt in the chest. Chaos. Screaming. Blood. Roosevelt's aides panicked. His guards lunged. The shooter was apprehended almost immediately. His name was John Flamung Schrank, and he claimed the ghost of William McKinley had told him to kill Roosevelt. You'd think the rally would be over. Cancelled. Hospital time. Not for Teddy. Roosevelt coughed into his hand. No blood. That meant the bullet hadn't hit a lung. So instead of collapsing or retreating, Roosevelt stood up, adjusted his coat, walked onto the stage, and addressed the shocked crowd. His opening line, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Applause. Confusion. Applause again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his speech. It was 50 pages long. The bullet had pierced the manuscript and his glasses case before lodging in his chest. The papers had slowed the bullet down, so he did the only rational thing. He gave the speech anyway. 90 minutes. Bleeding, wheezing, unstoppable. At one point, he told the crowd, "The bullet is in me now so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best." He spoke for an hour and a half. Then finally, he allowed himself to be taken to the hospital. Doctors found the bullet lodged in his muscle, but determined it would be safer to leave it there. Roosevelt carried it for the rest of his life, like a souvenir or a punctuation mark. This wasn't politics. It was myth-making in real time. Roosevelt turned a literal assassination attempt into an act of branding. He became the bull moose, indestructible, larger than life, unkillable. He didn't win the 1912 election, That went to Woodrow Wilson, but the story stuck. It still does, because Roosevelt wasn't running for power. He was running to be himself, unfiltered, bullet-resistant, manic, unstoppable. And that's what we remember. Not the vote tallies, but the man who bled through his shirt and still finished his sentence. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was never supposed to be president. Not because he was incapable, he was brilliant. Not because he lacked connections. He had Theodore Roosevelt backing him like a hype man with a handlebar mustache. And not because he didn't win the election. He did. He just didn't want the job. From day one, Taft made it known. His true ambition wasn't to sit in the Oval Office. It was to sit on the Supreme Court, where Roosevelt had chased war and Wilson would chase dreams. Taft chased legal nuance and procedural integrity. And yet, in 1908, Roosevelt basically shoved him onto the Republican ticket. Taft, ever loyal, accepted. And just like that, he was elected president, America's 27th, by accident of loyalty rather than appetite for power. But he never loved it. Not the politics, not the pressure, not the performative glad-handing. He disliked speeches, hated press attention, and found the presidency to be one long, awkward party where he didn't know anyone and couldn't leave early. He once wrote to a friend, "I don't remember that I ever was president. That's not modesty. That's dissociation." What he did remember vividly was how much he longed to be Chief Justice, to put on the robe, to interpret, not implement, to shape the law, not negotiate over dinner rolls and tariffs. The Supreme Court, to Taft, wasn't a stepping stone. It was the finish line. So, after his single term, after being humiliated by losing re-election in a three-way brawl between himself, Roosevelt, and Wilson, Taft slinked away from politics, taught law, wrote, waited, and then in 1921 his patience paid off. President Warren G. Harding, we'll get to his mistress-filled medical suite soon, appointed Taft Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Taft wept, publicly. He called it the happiest day of his life. Let's pause on that. The only man in U.S. history to have served as both President and Chief Justice openly stated he was prouder of the latter. No caveats, no polite euphemisms. The presidency? A burden. The Supreme Court? His dream. He served from 1921 to 1930. 9 years of legal clarity. 9 years of shaping judicial procedure, strengthening the court's authority, and revamping the system from within. He streamlined decisions, modernized court administration, wrote 253 opinions, many of them defining the balance between government and business in the roaring 20s, and he loved it. He once said, "I don't remember that I ever was president," because in a very real sense, he had emotionally blacked it out. The Oval Office was too political, too chaotic, too theatrical. The court, by contrast, was structured, orderly, quiet. It respected the weight of thought rather than the noise of applause. Taft literally died in the job. When his health began to fail, he wrote, "I am not up to it. I'm about to resign." 5 weeks later, in March 1930, he was gone. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, one of only 2 presidents buried there, and the only one whose legacy is divided between 2 branches of government. Most people don't even remember he was president. Taft would have liked that, but if Taft found his peace in robes and reason, his successor brought chaos in a nightgown. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a man of ideas, lofty ones, League of Nations level ideas. He talked like a preacher, wrote like a professor, and governed like a man who was genuinely surprised not everyone read the Federalist Papers for fun. He brought academic rigor to the presidency, along with a moral intensity that made his speeches sound like he was grading the world on a curve. But underneath the scholarship, the speeches, and the spectacles of international diplomacy, there was something dreamier, literally. Wilson believed in the power of dreams, not just as metaphors, but as messages. He wasn't mystical exactly, but he believed the subconscious was trying to tell him something. And once it did, with policy-altering results. The moment came during World War I, when the weight of neutrality, German U-boats, and mounting international pressure pressed down on Wilson's mind like the crown of an unwanted king. According to contemporaries and Wilson himself, the president once awoke from a dream so disturbing, so visceral, that he altered a major policy decision based on what his subconscious had shown him. We don't know the full content of the dream. Wilson never detailed it publicly, but we know the impact. It changed how he approached America's role in the world. It pushed him further toward a vision of peace through global cooperation, through treaties and collective security, eventually birthing the League of Nations. To Wilson, the dream wasn't irrational. It was insight. While other presidents talked to generals and advisors, Wilson listened to himself deep down in the caverns of his own sleep cycle. He took it as a sign, a nudge, maybe divine, maybe psychological, but definitely not something to ignore. And this wasn't a one-off thing. Wilson often spoke about his dreams, recorded them, and reflected on their symbolism. He believed dreams revealed moral truths, stripped of political calculation. Viewed as a diplomatic advisor, it's easy to mock until you realize he was navigating World War I, the greatest international cataclysm the world had ever seen. Every choice he made reshaped borders, alliances, futures. When the conscious mind fails to make sense of that weight, what's left but dreams? Of course, the irony is that Wilson's biggest dream, the League of Nations, was rejected by his own country. The Senate refused to join. His grand vision of collective security and permanent peace was left to wither on European soil. It broke him. He suffered a massive stroke in 1919 while touring the country to gain public support. The stroke left him incapacitated, partially paralyzed, and politically isolated. For the remainder of his presidency, his wife, Edith Wilson, quietly managed his affairs, a de facto regent shielding the nation from the fact that its leader could no longer lead. His presidency ended not with applause, but with whispers. Still, Wilson never let go of the dream. To the very end, he believed his vision would outlive him, that the world would one day recognize the righteousness of what he saw. Not just in strategy rooms, but in sleep. And maybe it did. The League of Nations failed, but its skeleton gave birth to the United Nations decades later, a dream deferred, but not forgotten. But if Wilson drifted through moral philosophy and midnight visions, the next guy crashed into the presidency with bourbon breath and a mistress upstairs. Let's move from the lecture hall to the speakeasy. It's time for Warren G. Harding and the secret love nest above the doctor's office. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was a man of appetites. He liked poker, he liked whiskey. This was during Prohibition, by the way. And he really liked women who weren't his wife. He looked like a respectable small-town senator, but Harding lived his presidency like a long, semi-public affair, with actual affairs baked in. Enter Nan Britton. She was 30 years his junior. He was president of the United States. She was his secret mistress. He was married, and the whole thing might have been less shocking if he hadn't given her her own private apartment above a doctor's office just blocks from the White House. Let that sink in. The leader of the free world was keeping his 20-something lover in a barely disguised hideaway in downtown Washington, D.C., complete with its own discreet entrance and medical cover story. It was supposed to be subtle. It was not. White House staffers knew, some Secret Service agents knew, even journalists had whispered hints. But Harding was charming. He smiled, he deflected, and when the questions got too pointed, he simply changed the subject or poured another drink. Harding and Nan Britton didn't just sneak kisses in side rooms. According to her later memoir, they had sex in a White House coat closet during meetings, while his wife was downstairs hosting guests. It was less presidential romance, more bad soap opera with a budget. Nan gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth Ann, in 1919, just before Harding was elected. He never publicly acknowledged the child, but Britton insisted he supported them both financially, even writing affectionate letters, some of which included pet names for his anatomy. They were later published in full humiliating detail. If Harding's presidency was boring, his sex life definitely was not. Britton would go on to write The President's Daughter, one of the earliest and juiciest presidential tell-alls. Critics dismissed her. Historians tried to erase her, but in 2015, nearly a century later, DNA tests confirmed her story. Elizabeth Ann was Harding's daughter, so yes. The rumors were real. The apartment existed. The love triangle wasn't metaphorical, it was architectural. Meanwhile, Harding's actual presidency? Scandal after scandal. His administration was riddled with corruption. The infamous Teapot Dome bribery debacle. Shady deals. Cronyism galore. Harding himself may not have been directly involved in all of it, But he appointed the people who were and turned a blind eye while they lined their pockets. He once said with tragic honesty, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." He died in 1923 suddenly, during a cross-country tour, possibly of a heart attack, possibly something more mysterious. There are conspiracy theories, of course. His wife refused an autopsy. He was buried quickly. The scandals rolled in afterward like storm clouds on a fixed schedule. But in a strange way, the thing people most remember isn't Teapot Dome. It's Nan Britton's upstairs apartment, because Harding didn't just cheat. He institutionalized it. He gave it a zip code, a floor plan, and if his presidency was defined by indulgence, the next one was defined by silence. Harding brought jazz-age excess. His successor brought petroleum jelly, quiet mornings, and a deeply weird obsession with having his head rubbed at breakfast. Let's meet Calvin Coolidge, the man who governed like a ghost and started his day slippery. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was not what you'd call a high-energy president. He spoke sparingly. He moved like a man trying not to startle ghosts. His public persona was so low wattage, he made beige look loud. They didn't call him Silent Cal because he was mysterious. They called him that because if you got more than 2 sentences out of him in a conversation, you basically won the lottery. But behind the quiet, there was a man of ritual, control, stillness, and something else. Petroleum jelly. Every morning, President Calvin Coolidge began his day in bed. Not with a newspaper, not with a staff briefing, but with a silent servant rubbing Vaseline into his scalp as he ate breakfast. Let's break that down. He stayed in bed. A tray was brought in, and as he munched on cereal or eggs, accounts vary, he received a full petroleum jelly scalp massage. Not joking, not metaphorical. A literal, slow rub down with greasy goo, administered with precision while the commander-in-chief digested toast. Coolidge believed this practice stimulated hair growth and prevented baldness. No doctors endorsed this. No science backed it. But Coolidge didn't need validation. He needed routine. The world was chaotic. The economy was roaring. The roaring 20s were in full swing. And the president was being gently greased in bed while the nation partied itself toward collapse. It wasn't the only strange quirk in Coolidge's life. He also had a deep fondness for being photographed with animals, including a raccoon named Rebecca, who briefly lived on the White House grounds and was walked on a leash like a presidential lapdog. He would reportedly press the buzzer on his desk for no reason just to see who came running. Once he refused to speak during an entire dinner, just to see how long others would fill the silence. Spoiler, they broke before he did. And through it all, Vaseline and all, he governed. Coolidge was a minimalist in policy and personality. He believed government should be as invisible as he was. Cut taxes, shrink spending, keep the federal footprint light, and the public debt lighter. It worked until it didn't. The stock market soared under his presidency, and he took credit for it, but the warning signs were ignored. The bubble grew. When it burst on his successor's watch, it was Coolidge's silent fingerprints all over the fuse. About what did he say about that? Not much. He left office in 1929, retired quietly, wrote little, talked less, and when asked about the political chaos he'd left behind, he offered only this: "I do not choose to run." That was it. Coolidge died in 1933. No fanfare, no scandal, just gone. Like smoke, or a dream you can't remember, but vaguely suspect, involved Vaseline and cornflakes. And if Coolidge governed from the shadows, his successor tried to control them. Because the next president, he bugged the White House. Herbert Hoover, the Quaker engineer who turned to surveillance before Nixon even bought his first tape recorder. Herbert Hoover was an engineer, a Quaker, a humanitarian, a man who, on paper, should have been the embodiment of moral restraint and civic virtue. But like many presidents before him and many more after, Hoover had a problem with trust. So he started listening. Secretly, and not in the metaphorical "I hear the people" way. No, Hoover literally bugged the White House. Before Nixon, before the FBI went full noir, and before wiretaps became shorthand for political scandal, Hoover had already turned the executive mansion into a makeshift surveillance hub. He installed a private listening system to monitor conversations within the West Wing and beyond. No official record of the exact scope exists, naturally, but multiple aides and staff later confirmed what had long been whispered. Hoover had ears in the walls. His presidency may have been defined by the Great Depression, but behind the scenes, it was defined by an obsession with control. To understand this, you have to understand the man. Hoover wasn't a glad-hander. He wasn't a big personality. He didn't charm crowds. He calculated them. He rose from orphaned Iowa nobody to globe-trotting mining magnate and international relief coordinator. By the time he reached the presidency in 1929, he saw himself as a kind of benevolent technocrat, a man who could solve the country like a math problem. The problem? America didn't want a quiet engineer. It wanted reassurance, empathy. Instead, it got charts and silence, and Hoover didn't trust anyone. Not his cabinet, not his staff, certainly not the press. So, according to reports, he installed microphones in select offices and even used eavesdropped conversations to keep political enemies in check. He didn't boast about it. He didn't legislate it. He just listened. Always. It's ironic, of course. Hoover's public persona was one of reserved idealism. The Quaker president, the humanitarian who once saved millions from famine after World War I. But inside the walls of the White House, he was quietly compiling intel, notes, names, fragments of conversations that might come in handy later. None of it helped when the stock market crashed. In October 1929, just months into his presidency, everything collapsed. Banks, jobs, confidence. People starved while Hoover clung to outdated economic orthodoxy and distant language. Prosperity is just around the corner, he insisted, while breadlines wrapped around blocks and Hoovervilles, the shantytowns named after him not affectionately, grew by the day. His surveillance didn't save him. His data didn't shield him. His bugged White House couldn't tell him what the people had already shouted. By 1932, his presidency was over. FDR swept in with fireside chats and big government dreams, while Hoover retreated, bitter, bruised, and still convinced that everyone else had gotten it wrong. But he left behind something darker, a precedent. He was the first to plant microphones in the house of democracy, the first to turn suspicion into architecture, the first to listen where trust should have been, and that legacy, while forgotten by many, would echo into future presidencies, when surveillance wouldn't just be strategy, it would be scandal. But the next president, he didn't spy. He designed. Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't wire the White House. He reshaped it, literally, including the Oval Office rug, which he personally designed with symbolic geometry to reflect wartime purpose and psychological clarity. Let's unravel the strange, elegant obsession of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt wasn't just a strategist. He was a curator. While other presidents rearranged cabinets, FDR rearranged space. He understood more than most that power had a shape, and that shape could be seen, felt, even walked across. Which brings us to the thing most people overlook when talking about the longest-serving president in U.S. history. He personally designed the Oval Office rug, and not just any rug, a custom, symbolic, geometrically rich tapestry designed to communicate intention, stability, and centrality. Without saying a single word, it wasn't just decor. It was doctrine, stitched into thread. The story begins in 1933. Roosevelt was sworn in during the Great Depression with a paralyzed lower body, a banking system in cardiac arrest, and the entire country teetering between despair and rage. From the very beginning, Roosevelt understood that the presidency wasn't just about what you said. It was about where you said it from. The Oval Office, until then, had been just another room, a workspace, a glorified backdrop. Roosevelt turned it into the stage of 20th century power. He didn't just redesign it, he ritualized it. And the rug, that was the anchor. Woven in dark blues and golds, Roosevelt's rug featured an American eagle at its center, surrounded by rays, stars, and a carefully measured symmetry that mirrored the room itself. Every visual element was intentional. Circles for continuity, rays for reach. An eagle not in flight, but poised, ready. Roosevelt wanted to stand on something that reflected what he was building. A presidency that would not wobble. one that radiated outward, not just to governors and generals, but to every radio crackling in every farmhouse. The rug was part of the signal. And remember, this is a man who could not walk unaided. FDR sat behind his desk not by choice, but necessity. His design decisions weren't just aesthetic, they were compensatory. If he could not move through the world like other men, then the world would be shaped around him. He created spaces of dominance with symmetry, lighting, visual language, long before optics became a PR buzzword. And it worked. Reporters were not allowed to photograph him in his wheelchair. Guests never saw him stumble. And behind that desk, standing on that rug, Roosevelt became a visual monolith. Commanding, grounded, calculated, the rug saw him through the New Deal, through Pearl Harbor, through Yalta, through fireside chats and wartime decrees. It became a quiet totem of resilience. And when future presidents changed the rug, they weren't just redecorating, they were breaking the spell. Roosevelt had fused style and symbolism into an architectural language of control. He understood the geometry of empire and stitched it into wool. But beneath all the symmetry, FDR's health was collapsing. He masked his heart problems, hid strokes, refused to appear weak, even as the weight of the world, quite literally, crushed his circulatory system. In April 1945, just months into his unprecedented fourth term, Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia. The rug outlived him. Still, FDR left behind more than furniture. He left behind a model, not of power grabbed, but crafted. Because if Roosevelt controlled rooms, his successor tried to outrun them. Let's talk about Harry S. Truman, the everyman president who liked to walk the streets of Washington alone, without guards, without warning, and without fear. Just him and death keeping pace. Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman had no college degree, no wealthy backers, no polished charisma. He didn't ride into office on legacy or flash. He stumbled into it on the heels of a dying titan. One day, he was Franklin Roosevelt's relatively unknown vice president. The next, he was commander-in-chief of a world at war. His first briefing as president included 3 words that would define the rest of the century: the atomic bomb. Most men would have collapsed under the weight. Truman, he laced up his shoes and went for a walk. That was his thing. Every morning at precisely 5:30 a.m., Truman would rise, throw on a suit, and walk the streets of Washington, D.C., not just around the White House grounds, through the actual city, past monuments, shops, pedestrians. No motorcade, no crowd control. Sometimes Secret Service tagged along, sometimes not. And even when they did, he left them in the dust. "You want to walk with me?" he'd say. "Then keep up." This wasn't some charming quirk. It was how Truman coped. The world expected him to carry nuclear secrets, reconstruct Europe, and hold off Stalin, while pretending he knew what he was doing. So he walked. Past breakfast joints, past construction sites, past the Capitol he now partially controlled. Every step was a dare. I will not be ruled by fear. You see, Truman was the first truly postmodern president. There were no illusions of divine right, no aristocratic polish. He was short, wore thick glasses, worked retail, had failed businesses. He didn't hide the stress. He embraced it. And his morning walks were proof. In an era before presidential jogs or fitness PR, Truman turned walking into a ritual of defiance, not just against assassination, though there were plenty of threats, but against paranoia, against insulation, against becoming one of those politicians who talks about the people but never walks among them. Once a man ran up to him during a walk, sprinted toward the president full speed. The Secret Service panicked. Truman didn't flinch. The man just wanted to shake his hand. Truman obliged. He said, "That's what I'm out here for." But that openness wasn't without risk. In 1950, Puerto Rican nationalists attempted to assassinate him at Blair House, where he was staying during White House renovations. A shootout erupted on the steps. One officer was killed. Truman was upstairs, resting. He calmly looked out the window as bullets flew, then went back inside. The next morning, he went for his walk. This was Truman's presidency in a nutshell. Small man, big decisions, zero drama. He dropped the atomic bomb twice. He fired General MacArthur, one of the most popular military figures in the country, like he was sending back a cold steak. He desegregated the military by executive order. He launched the Marshall Plan and he walked. Because for Truman, walking wasn't just exercise, it was resistance. Resistance to becoming unreachable, resistance to fear, resistance to forgetting that ultimately the president is still a man, one who walks the same streets as the people he serves. But if Truman embodied humble grit, the next man brought suburban rage in a 5-star uniform. Dwight D. Eisenhower was calm on the surface, but deep in the heart of America's favorite general was a murderous vendetta against squirrels. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, architect of D-Day, beloved war hero, and 34th President of the United States, had one great, burning hatred in his otherwise famously even-keeled life: squirrels. Not communists, not corporate lobbyists, not even his political rivals. It was those jittery, acorn-hoarding fluffballs that got under Ike's skin like shrapnel. Why? Because Eisenhower had a putting green installed on the White House South Lawn. This was his sanctuary, his slice of order, a patch of American perfection where the war hero could unwind alone, focusing on geometry, patience, and rhythm, 3 things that had once helped him save Europe. And then came the squirrels. They burrowed, they scampered, they dug holes in the green, leaving Eisenhower's carefully cultivated turf looking like the aftermath of a rodent trench war. And Ike, a man who'd commanded millions of troops across the European theater, was not about to surrender to woodland pests. At first he complained, then he ordered his staff to remove them. The squirrels returned. He called in the Secret Service. Yes, the President of the United States ordered the Secret Service to eliminate the squirrels. This is not an exaggeration. They were directed to trap, remove, and, according to some reports, shoot squirrels that dared enter Eisenhower's 9-hole sanctum. Presidential aides tried to downplay the situation, but witnesses remember the message being loud and clear: the squirrels must go. It was like Caddyshack if the gopher had been facing down the man who beat Hitler. This tiny war waged on quietly through his administration. No treaties, no negotiations, just man versus nature. And in that, there's something oddly poetic. Eisenhower, the man who had led a global coalition through the greatest military conflict in history, spent his twilight years losing his mind over yard rodents. And really, can you blame him? He lived a life of service. He avoided personality cults, warned against the military-industrial complex, balanced budgets, built highways, and all he asked for in return was a smooth patch of grass and 5 minutes of peace. The squirrels said no. This bizarre presidential feud was never mentioned in press conferences. It didn't derail policy, but it reveals something uniquely human, that even the most stoic of leaders has a breaking point. And sometimes it's fur-covered and covered in dirt. Ike's squirrel war wasn't just about rodents. It was about control, and that might be why it bothered him so much. The world he'd once ruled with maps and airlifts had shrunk down to turf, vermin, and the maddening chaos of molehills. He could win a world war, but he couldn't get the damn squirrels to respect his putting game. But if Eisenhower quietly hated squirrels, the next president publicly loved women, and sometimes didn't bother checking if they were on the visitor log. Let's dive, literally, into John F. Kennedy's White House pool, where meetings got wet, boundaries got blurry, and swimsuits were strictly optional. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was many things: war hero, youngest elected president, Cold War icon, and speechwriter's dream. He gave us the moonshot, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the New Frontier, Camelot. But behind the presidential polish, beneath the expertly tailored suits and clipped New England vowels, was a very different kind of operator, because JFK didn't just hold informal meetings. He held them in the pool, at the White House, often nude. Let's backstroke through this. The White House indoor swimming pool was installed in 1933 for Franklin D. Roosevelt, who used it for therapy and relaxation due to his paralysis. It was a modest, enclosed room off the West Wing, just steps from the Oval Office. When JFK took office in 1961, he reclaimed the pool, but he did so in his own distinctly Kennedy fashion, as a meeting spot, a hangout zone, a stress release valve, and occasionally a secret stage for assignations that had little to do with national security, unless your definition of diplomacy included skinny dipping. Kennedy would take meetings in the pool, important meetings. Staffers, advisors, reporters, even foreign dignitaries were sometimes summoned poolside. His aides called it water therapy. And it wasn't always metaphorical. JFK's back was a mess. He wore a brace. The pool helped him move more freely, but then there were the other guests, women, sometimes multiple, often not on official schedules, usually very young. Most famously, Mimi Alford, a 19-year-old White House intern, later revealed in her memoir that JFK took her virginity in Jackie Kennedy's bedroom, then regularly invited her for swims, sometimes during work hours, sometimes while his staff waited awkwardly nearby. According to Alford and others, swimsuits were optional. Conversations ranged from flirtation to policy. Boundaries dissolved, both social and ethical. This wasn't just a president blowing off steam. It was a man conducting his presidency like a charismatic lifeguard with a nuclear briefcase. The Secret Service knew. Some aides tried to look the other way. Others joked, darkly, that the chlorine must be doing double duty. This was the secret underbelly of Camelot. The image, idealism, youth, vigor. The reality, seduction, secrecy, and a pool that functioned like a very exclusive speakeasy with national security implications. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The blurred lines in Kennedy's pool weren't just moral. They were strategic vulnerabilities. At least one woman he spent time with had ties to mob figures. There were rumors of East German spies. The FBI quietly panicked, and yet nothing stopped. The pool remained. The swims continued, the charm endured, because Kennedy was the kind of man people wanted to forgive. He sparkled. Even when he misbehaved, he did it with teeth-white brilliance and mythic timing. The tragedies of his life, his illness, his war wounds, his eventual assassination, all retroactively shrouded his vices in mist. But the pool was real, still is. In fact, it's now underneath the White House press briefing room. The floor was built directly on top of it during the Nixon administration, meaning every time a press secretary spins a half-truth to a room full of journalists, they're doing it over the site of Kennedy's unofficial aquatic affairs. And if JFK blurred the lines between duty and desire, his successor did the opposite. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't blur lines. He redrew them, he didn't seduce, he cornered, especially in his car, where he'd trap unsuspecting victims with a fake engine failure and force them to listen while he lectured them into psychological submission. Lyndon B. Johnson. If John F. Kennedy was the cool, polished frontman of the 1960s presidency, Lyndon B. Johnson was the bouncer behind him. Sweaty, aggressive, and way too close to your face. LBJ didn't do subtlety, he didn't do small talk, he didn't do personal space, and he definitely didn't do short conversations. In fact, he invented new ways to trap people into listening to him, because when you're 6 feet 3 inches, sharp-tongued, and absolutely convinced that your opinion is the most important sound in the room, regular tactics just don't cut it. So what did Johnson do? He rigged his car to fake a breakdown, just so he could trap people inside with him and talk. For hours, no escape, no destination, just LBJ in a wide Stetson, in his personal Lincoln Continental, monologuing you into submission while pretending the engine was acting up. This wasn't just a prank, it was policy delivery. LBJ would invite political opponents, donors, staffers, anyone he needed to persuade, on what seemed like a casual drive around his Texas ranch. They'd climb in, the sun would be shining, the landscape pastoral, and then suddenly the car would cough. Jerky motion, sputtering sounds. Damn thing again, Johnson would mutter. Let's just wait a minute. Then came the monologue. About Vietnam, about Medicare, about why you were wrong, about his childhood, about the godforsaken cattle industry, about how he had dirt on you, about how you were going to vote for his bill if you ever wanted to see daylight again. This wasn't a conversation. This was political waterboarding in an Oldsmobile. Johnson had many of these tactics. He was infamous for conducting meetings while on the toilet. He'd leave the door open and keep talking. Didn't matter who you were, senator, aide, dignitary. You were going to hear about school desegregation while he flushed. He'd lean over people, jab fingers into chests, whisper threats in a drawl soaked in intimidation and syrup. They called it the Johnson treatment, and it worked. He passed the Civil Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, education funding, the Great Society. He twisted arms until laws bent. He made people uncomfortable and then used that discomfort to change the country. But the fake car trouble bit, that was his masterpiece because it didn't require status, just proximity. Once that door clicked shut, you were in his world now. Imagine it. Middle of nowhere, prairie stretching for miles, engine idling, no cell phones, no exits, just LBJ in the driver's seat. Legs spread, eyes squinting, spinning a yarn about a bill he needs passed and why you're going to be the one to pass it. You know something, he'd say, voice low and deadly calm. My daddy always said a man who don't help another man plow his field ain't got no right to eat the harvest. What does that mean? Doesn't matter. You're voting yes. And then, miraculously, the car would start again. Hell, looks like it fixed itself. And off you go. Shell-shocked, persuaded, spiritually hijacked. LBJ didn't invent psychological warfare, but he domesticated it, gave it wheels, wrapped it in a folksy southern drawl, and weaponized it on every legislative backroad. And if LBJ was all about control, persuasion, and the uncomfortable physicality of power, his successor had a much stranger relationship with the body, specifically milk. Richard Nixon hated milk, feared it, described it as foul, refused to drink it unless it was practically prescribed, and even then he did it like a man choking down cyanide. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not a man known for vulnerability. He was cold, calculating, and emotionally waterproof. The man could survive televised humiliation, an impeachment scandal, and decades of professional paranoia. But one thing could crack the icy shell of Nixon's resolve. Milk. Yes. Plain, harmless, American as apple pie milk. Nixon didn't just dislike it, he hated it. Described it as foul. He only drank it, under protest, when a doctor insisted. And even then, witnesses said he sipped it like he was performing a ritual exorcism. Quick. Grimacing, as if it might revolt in his throat and scream Watergate confessions on the way down. Let's unpack this. The aversion began early. Nixon had an iron will but a delicate gut. As a child, he was sickly, prone to infections. Milk was prescribed often as a cure-all, which probably explains why he grew to associate it with illness, weakness, or the haunting taste of obligation. By adulthood, it had become full-on dairy aversion. Staffers were warned, catering crews briefed. The White House kitchen operated like a lactose-intolerant submarine. Milk was not to be seen, not served, not mentioned. There's something poetic about this, isn't there? The man who opened China, who debated Khrushchev in a mock American kitchen in Moscow, who survived McCarthyism and invented modern political theater, couldn't face a glass of milk without recoiling like a vampire at dawn. It wasn't just flavor, it was ideological. Nixon famously loved ketchup, cottage cheese, and pineapple together in an unholy culinary alliance. But milk was where he drew the line. It was too clean, too wholesome, too straightforward. Milk was for people who trusted others. Nixon did not. His entire presidency was built on subtext, paranoia, shadows. He wiretapped his own administration. He created enemies lists. He wore suits on the beach. He faked casualness like other people fake orgasms. Milk doesn't lie, and that terrified him. Even his doctor, John Lunkin, had to sneak milk into his diet under medical pretense. He needed calcium, Lunkin explained later. But getting Nixon to drink it required strategic framing. Doctor's orders, for your bones. It's not about enjoyment, it's about survival. Nixon complied, of course. He was too disciplined not to, but every sip was a war. A secret loss, a micro-Watergate of the soul, and that's where it becomes more than a dietary quirk. Nixon's revulsion toward milk was on brand. This was a man constantly battling his own humanity, suppressing it, disguising it, outmaneuvering it. Milk, in all its creamy innocence, represented vulnerability, which is why it wasn't just a drink. It was a trigger. He didn't cry at funerals. He didn't laugh easily. But he would recoil from a glass of milk like it had personally betrayed him. And maybe it had. Because in a world where everyone might be out to get you, milk is just another smiling liar in a white suit. But if Nixon micromanaged liquids like state secrets, His successor struggled to manage something even more basic: access to the White House. Let's talk about Gerald Ford, the man who accidentally locked himself out of the most secure residence in the world while wearing a bathrobe. Gerald Ford had a talent for falling upward. He wasn't elected vice president. He wasn't elected president. He just happened to be standing near the top when Nixon's presidency collapsed like a soggy cardboard box in a rainstorm. Suddenly, this former football player from Michigan, humble, likable, kind of clumsy, was president, and then he locked himself out of the White House in a bathrobe. Here's how it happened. Ford had a habit of waking up early, very early, and wandering around the residence, sometimes even stepping outside for air. On one of those mornings in the pre-dawn stillness of Washington, he shuffled out in a bathrobe and slippers, enjoying the quiet. But somewhere in that fog of half-sleep and presidential solitude, the door shut behind him, locked. Now let's paint this picture accurately. Here's the President of the United States, fresh from Watergate, trying to stabilize a shattered republic, standing barefoot or sock-footed in a bathrobe on the White House porch, realizing he is literally locked out of the government. No keys, no staff awake yet, no Secret Service in immediate sight, just Ford, alone, embarrassed, very roby. Eventually, agents noticed the president wasn't inside. They found him waiting, perhaps sheepishly, perhaps bemused, perhaps wondering if this was the real metaphor for his presidency. They let him back in. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't spin it. He didn't call for a press blackout or blame anyone else. He just laughed, shrugged, went back to work. That was Ford in a nutshell. Accident-prone, endearing, completely aware of his flaws, and never afraid to look foolish. He stumbled publicly more than once, falling down airplane stairs, bumping heads, tripping on stage. But rather than deny it, Ford leaned in. His approval ratings were lukewarm. His pardon of Nixon infuriated the country, but he never hid behind bluster. He governed like your uncle trying to fix the sink himself. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it flooded the kitchen. And if you think the bathrobe incident was a fluke, Ford had other domestic mishaps. He once knocked over a table of wine glasses at a state dinner. He bonked Queen Elizabeth II on the foot while dancing. He was shot at twice in separate assassination attempts within 17 days, and famously survived both without losing his sense of humor or his schedule. It's almost like the universe kept throwing banana peels at him, and he kept saying, well, I guess that's politics. But Ford's bathrobe saga wasn't just a gag. It was a perfect image for a post-scandal presidency trying to reestablish normalcy. He wasn't Nixon, hiding behind recordings and paranoia. He was just a guy who forgot to prop open the door. And in a way, that's what the country needed. Someone who didn't take himself too seriously. Someone who could laugh, then legislate. Someone who'd lock himself out and then walk into a briefing about inflation. Ford never won an election, but for a brief, weird, comforting time, he was the calm after the storm. And if Ford was the president of unintentional comedy, the next guy was a deep thinker with a fishing pole, a man who practiced an ancient, almost meditative art of fishing without bait. Let's meet Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer turned president who pioneered what might be history's most passive-aggressive form of contemplation. Jimmy Carter didn't fish to catch anything. He fished to think. He called it Zen casting, an oddly poetic habit where he'd take his rod, find a quiet stretch of water near his home in Plains, Georgia, and cast a line with no bait, no worms, no lures, no hooks, just line and thought. Over and over, smooth, silent, intentionally useless. This wasn't fishing, it was meditation. And honestly, it explains everything about Jimmy Carter's presidency. Carter was not a politician by nature. He was an engineer, a Sunday school teacher, a peanut farmer who read Reinhold Niebuhr and believed the Bible wasn't a prop. It was a responsibility. He governed like a man who believed morality could fix systems, that logic could soothe chaos, that if you just cast enough silent lines into the water, eventually something meaningful would surface. But Washington was not Plains. When Carter arrived in D.C. in 1977, he brought with him a deep discomfort for the political machinery around him. He refused limousine motorcades, sold off parts of the presidential yacht, walked during his own inaugural parade, wore sweaters in the Oval Office, and asked Americans to do the same during energy shortages. He was earnest, profoundly so, and that was his problem. In the age of flash and televised confidence, Carter governed like he was still on his front porch, thoughtful, patient, quietly casting. Sometimes it worked. He brokered the Camp David Accords, a landmark peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. He created the Department of Energy. He deregulated airlines. He was the first president to speak openly and seriously about climate change. But other times, Zen casting just looked like doing nothing. He didn't fight back when attacked. He didn't play the game. During the Iran hostage crisis, as the country boiled with outrage, Carter stayed cautious, negotiating, thinking, waiting. It felt passive, even as it was strategic. And the world judged him for it. They wanted a fisherman who could reel in results. Carter stood on the dock and watched the water. The image of Carter casting a baitless line became, unintentionally, the metaphor of his administration. Deep thought, minimal movement, deliberate inaction in a world demanding fireworks. And yet, what other president still builds houses for the poor at 98? What other former leader won a Nobel Peace Prize after office, not for his legacy, but for his lifelong commitment to peace, democracy, and diplomacy? Carter might not have baited the hook, but he knew how to keep casting. He was America's conscience. Not always exciting, not always effective, but always watching the ripples. Still, for every still lake, there's a sugar rush waiting to happen. Because the next president didn't reflect quietly in nature, he devoured jelly beans like a toddler at a trade show. Hundreds of thousands of them. Ronald Reagan didn't cast lines. He tossed candy into every room he entered, and sometimes into global diplomacy. Ronald Reagan didn't just like jelly beans. He weaponized them. By the time he stepped into the Oval Office in 1981, the former Hollywood actor and California governor had already developed a very public and very personal addiction to the colorful little candies. His brand, Jelly Belly, his favorite flavor, licorice, his consumption, unrelenting. And unlike most presidential quirks, Reagan's jelly bean obsession wasn't kept behind closed doors. No, he put bowls of jelly beans in every room of the White House. Cabinet meetings, press briefings, intelligence debriefs. Jelly beans were everywhere, like little chewy emissaries of optimism. There was even a special jelly bean holder built for Air Force One, nailed down to withstand turbulence during Cold War flights, while carrying nuclear codes, because nothing says mutually assured destruction like a rogue cinnamon bean bouncing off the Situation Room projector. It started innocently enough. Reagan had begun using jelly beans in the late 1960s to help him quit pipe smoking. The sugar helped the cravings. The habit stuck. But once he became president, the beans became more than a snack. They became a symbol. In a world rattled by inflation, hostage crises, and nuclear threats, Reagan's jelly beans sent a different message. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine. Look, candy. And he didn't just consume them, he gifted them. When British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher visited, she got jelly beans. When Mikhail Gorbachev arrived for a tense Cold War summit, Reagan offered him a handful of jelly beans. It wasn't a stunt, it was diplomacy. Reagan style, casual, cheerful, Americana with a sugar shell. There was even a Jelly Belly Reagan assortment created in his honor. Red, cherry, white, coconut, and blue, blueberry flavors. Presidential patriotism in bean form. Reagan didn't just eat them, he endorsed them. The CEO of Jelly Belly publicly credited him for their global rise. It sounds absurd. It kind of is. But here's the thing. It worked. Reagan's jelly bean diplomacy was part of a larger mythos. This idea that the president wasn't just a leader, but a reassurer-in-chief, the Gipper, grandpa in cowboy boots, a man who could face down the Soviet Union with one hand on the briefcase and the other in the candy jar. Of course, the sugar-coated surface belied a presidency full of contradictions. Reagan oversaw massive military spending, controversial foreign interventions, and the slow dismantling of New Deal social programs. His administration sparked both economic recovery and growing inequality. He promised smaller government and delivered bigger deficits. But the jelly beans, they stayed through it all. An edible metaphor, sweet, colorful, simple, and impossible to fully digest without getting a little bit of something stuck in your teeth. And when Reagan left office in 1989, he didn't take the beans with him. He left them behind. The White House candy bowls stayed filled. The symbolism stuck. He had shown the world that sometimes the softest touch can make the hardest point. But if Reagan expressed rebellion through sugar, his successor brought something stranger to the table: socks. Specifically, novelty socks. Because George H.W. Bush didn't just lead global coalitions and vomit on a Japanese prime minister. He also built a legacy one mismatched ankle at a time. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush had all the makings of a traditional president. He was a World War II hero, a Yale man, former CIA director, vice president under Reagan. He came into office in 1989 wrapped in dignified restraint, fatherly competence, and the carefully pressed khakis of American establishment politics. And then there were the socks. Not just socks. Loud socks. Flamingos, stripes, polka dots, American flags, cartoon characters, neon clashes, and Christmas themes worn proudly at state dinners, global summits, and funerals. George H.W. Bush's ankles weren't just covered, they were communicating. They said, "Yes, I'm the most powerful man in the world, and I am also wearing dancing pigs." It started subtly, a flash of color beneath a sober blue suit. But as his presidency ended and his post-presidential years began, the socks got bolder, more frequent, less accessory, more personality with toes, and the world noticed. Dignitaries came to expect them. Reporters started documenting them. Kids sent him custom designs. He wore socks supporting veterans, socks for cancer awareness, socks for charity events, socks that matched the mood of the nation. They were cheerful, weirdly subversive, and totally intentional. Because for a man as famously restrained as Bush, who loathed the vision thing and once dryly described broccoli as banned from Air Force One, his socks became a loophole, a quiet rebellion, a way to say, hey, I'm still here, still weird, still having fun. It was especially powerful coming from him. Bush wasn't flashy. He didn't play saxophone on late-night TV. He didn't confide in interns or give soaring rhetorical flourishes. He was the president of polite handshakes and read my lips, and yet his socks were shouting from the ankles up. Even in death, the socks stayed loud. At his state funeral in 2018, per his request, Bush was buried wearing a pair of socks decorated with fighter planes, an homage to his time as a Navy pilot in World War II. One final statement, subtle as a runway salute. And really, isn't that the most George H.W. Bush thing imaginable? To express emotion not through tweets or tantrums, but through tastefully absurd hosiery. It's the kind of low-key legacy that sneaks up on you. A reminder that even the most boring presidents contain contradictions. The measured statesman with a sock drawer that looked like a birthday party gone rogue. But if Bush's rebellion lived at sock level, his successor brought the whole jazz band. Because Bill Clinton didn't just step into the spotlight. He saxophoned his way into it, live on stage, shades on, lip curled, charisma dialed up to 11. Bill Clinton didn't walk onto the political stage. He grooved onto it. America's 42nd president came equipped with a Southern drawl, a Rhodes Scholar mind, and the uncanny ability to make a handshake feel like a slow dance. But nothing captured his style, his rhythm, more than the instrument that helped define his early political image, the saxophone. Let's rewind to 1992. Clinton was the underdog Democratic candidate, trying to unseat incumbent George H.W. Bush. The country was skeptical. The economy was sluggish. And then came a saxophone solo on the Arsenio Hall show. Clinton stepped onto the late-night stage wearing dark sunglasses, holding his sax like he was auditioning for Earth, Wind, Fire. He played Heartbreak Hotel. The audience lost it. Suddenly he wasn't just a candidate. He was cool. It was a PR move, sure, but a brilliant one. In a single performance, Clinton teleported presidential optics into the MTV age. He didn't just say he was relatable. He performed relatability. And it wasn't just a stunt. Clinton was good. He had been playing since his teens. Music was his outlet, his language, his armor. The sax wasn't just a prop. It was part of his rhythm, both literal and political. Once elected, Clinton brought that same improvisational energy into the White House. He jammed with jazz legends inside the executive mansion. Lionel Hampton, Wynton Marsalis, even played duets at private functions. The East Room became an occasional jazz club with nuclear clearance. But more than the performances, the saxophone represented how Clinton governed. With improvisation, charm, and a touch of chaos, he'd riff on policy in meetings, shift tone mid-interview, play both sides of an issue with a finger wag and a wink. He was always in the pocket, just enough ahead of the beat to feel spontaneous, just enough behind it to feel human. But like any jazz solo, it wasn't all smooth. Because improvisation without restraint, that leads to dissonance. Clinton's presidency was a tightrope walk between brilliance and scandal. He balanced budget surpluses and impeachment hearings. He brokered peace accords while fumbling personal boundaries. He blew the roof off approval ratings while ducking legal depositions. And through it all, you could almost hear the sax, bending, sliding, spinning a solo around a collapsing chord. That's the Clinton paradox, a man who could electrify a room with charm, then leave it drenched in controversy. His presidency was jazz, messy, brilliant, overconfident, and unforgettable. And while Clinton played sax to seduce America, the next president spent his childhood blowing up frogs with firecrackers. Let's talk about George W. Bush, the man who took America into 2 wars and started with a boyhood hobby that would have gotten most kids grounded forever. George W. Bush. Before the wars, before the brush-clearing photo ops, before misunderestimated entered the American political lexicon, George W. Bush was just a kid with a box of firecrackers and a questionable moral compass. Specifically, he had a thing for blowing up frogs. This isn't political satire. It's an actual story, told by Bush himself in interviews and recounted in multiple biographies. As a boy growing up in Midland, Texas, young George W. would capture frogs, stick firecrackers in various proximity to their little bodies, and then, well, boom. He called it fun. He called it science. But mostly it was destruction for destruction's sake. We'd put firecrackers in the frogs and throw them, he once recalled with the nostalgic tone of someone remembering a beloved family pet. Not a backyard war crime. Now, let's be fair. A lot of kids do weird, cruel things in the name of curiosity. That doesn't mean they grow up to launch actual wars. But in Bush's case, the metaphor is just too perfect to ignore. Because the boy who once lit the fuse and looked away became the president who did something eerily similar in Iraq. In 2003, following the September event, George W. Bush launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq, citing weapons of mass destruction that were never found. The war would go on to last nearly a decade, kill hundreds of thousands, destabilize a region, and reshape global politics. And it began with the same kind of logic he once used in that Texas field. This seems dangerous. Let's blow it up and see what happens. The comparison is almost too clean. The frogs? Unquestioning targets. The firecrackers? Tools of choice handed down by Dad, Bush Sr. that is. The throw? Casual, confident, detached. But George W. Bush was never a monster. Just impulsive. He governed like someone who thought life was a collection of decisive moments, and that consequences were always someone else's department. He was famous for gut feelings, early bedtimes, and that permanent half squint of "did I leave the oven on?" To his credit, Bush had moments of real clarity. His AIDS relief program in Africa saved millions. His response to the September event was emotionally unifying, if geopolitically disastrous. He redefined the modern presidency, for better and worse, with swagger and a vocabulary that always felt like it had one foot stuck in a Dr. Seuss rhyme scheme. And yet, the frog story sticks, because it feels like a Rosetta Stone for his entire approach to power. Explosive, juvenile, kinetic, strangely charming, and oblivious to cleanup. But the next president, he didn't blow up frogs. He received a 9-foot albino monkey statue from a foreign dignitary and left it haunting a White House hallway like some diplomatic fever dream. Let's talk about Barack Obama, a president who balanced symbolism, stoicism, and one extremely cursed primate statue from Senegal. Barack Obama. Barack Obama's presidency was defined by poise. He was articulate, composed, and surgically cool, more likely to quote Lincoln or Coltrane than to raise his voice. Every move seemed choreographed for historical weight, every speech a TED Talk with better lighting. So naturally, when the president of Senegal gifted him a 9-foot albino monkey statue, it disrupted the vibe. And yes, this really happened. During a diplomatic visit, the Senegalese president offered Obama a traditional art piece meant to symbolize cultural reverence, ancestral wisdom, or something. What arrived, however, was a massive, ghostly white primate sculpture, towering over staffers like a haunted Macy's parade balloon frozen in horror. It had long arms, a fixed expression, and that uncanny energy shared by department store mannequins and dreams that end with you waking up sweating. The statue was made of fiberglass, awkwardly shaped for any standard White House space, and yet, for reasons unknown, it wasn't sent to storage. Nope. It was placed in one of the main hallways, where it proceeded to silently haunt passersby for weeks. Imagine, you're a junior staffer, you've just grabbed coffee, you round a corner, and there it is. A pale fiberglass monkey, arms outstretched, staring directly into your soul like it knows where the nuclear codes are. Nobody talked about it officially. No press release, no photos. But internally, it became legend. Staff joked about it in hushed tones. Some claimed it moved slightly at night. Others swore its eyes followed them. One particularly bold aide is rumored to have dressed it in a scarf during winter, an act that nearly sparked an international incident. It wasn't a scandal. It was worse. An unsolvable aesthetic problem. Obama himself, reportedly amused, didn't rush to relocate it. After all, what do you do with a 9-foot albino monkey from a diplomatic ally? Regift it? Paint it? Banish it to Camp David like it broke curfew? Eventually, it was quietly moved. No ceremony, no explanation. To a storage area or perhaps a less trafficked wing. But by then, its legend was cemented. Because that statue was more than art. It was a perfect metaphor. Obama's presidency was constantly navigating the tension between control and absurdity. He was the rational mind trapped in an irrational news cycle, a man of precision facing birther conspiracies, congressional obstruction, and Twitter wars before Twitter was even fully weaponized. He brought universal health care, killed bin Laden, restored America's global image, and yet, in the background of it all, a 9-foot albino monkey loomed silently in a hallway, reminding everyone that dignity and weirdness are never mutually exclusive. Because no matter how controlled the message, reality has a sense of humor. And if Obama was haunted by fiberglass diplomacy, his successor leaned into symbolism of a different kind, a red button on the resolute desk that summoned Diet Coke. Not metaphorically, physically. Let's crack open the carbonated chaos of Donald Trump's Oval Office beverage button. Donald Trump. When Donald J. Trump entered the Oval Office in January 2017, he inherited centuries of presidential tradition, an office shaped by war, law, and principle. Naturally, he added a red button. Not the red button, mind you. Not the one controlling nukes or launching fighter jets. No, this was a different red button. One with a single purpose: to summon a Diet Coke. Not kidding. Right there on the resolute desk, next to briefing folders and pens used to sign executive orders, was a small, boxy red button. Press it, and a White House staffer would appear, silver tray in hand, with a perfectly chilled glass bottle of Diet Coke. No words, no awkward waiting, just ping and fizz. This wasn't a one-off moment. It was a feature of the Trump presidency. Multiple journalists confirmed it. Interviewees watched it happen in real time. Guests would glance nervously at the button, unsure whether they were one press away from international warfare, only to see a butler arrive with soda like it was an offering to a soft drink pharaoh. The setup was perfect. Oval Office, ornate curtains, portraits of Washington and Lincoln, the president lounging in his chair, and a mysterious red button that screamed, "Do not press," to anyone who grew up watching spy movies. But for Trump, it wasn't about novelty. It was about control. Trump didn't drink, but he mainlined Diet Coke. Reports estimate he drank a dozen a day. Not cans, glass bottles. His personal fuel, his lifeblood, his caffeinated confidence boost. It wasn't about hydration, it was about ritual, and like everything else in the Trump administration, it had to be theatrical, because nothing about Trump was quiet. Every gesture had to double as a branding moment. The button was more than convenience, it was on brand. Simple, decadent, pointlessly opulent, fast food in a tuxedo. And yet, it tells you everything. Where previous presidents put paperweights and policy memos, Trump put a dispenser of indulgence. He saw the Oval Office not just as a workplace, but a stage, a personal lounge, a set dressing where the president didn't just lead, he performed being president. And the Diet Coke button, that was part of the character, not the tyrant, not the scholar, but the CEO of America, running the country like a hotel with a dedicated minibar staff. The best part? When Joe Biden took office, he had the button removed immediately. It was the political version of walking into your new apartment and taking down the weird velvet painting of the last tenant's cat. Respectfully, but firmly, and yet you can't unpress history. The image of Trump casually pressing a mysterious button to order soda while discussing global trade with foreign dignitaries is now part of the American canon, because while some leaders left behind doctrines and others left behind monuments, Trump left a Diet Coke bell. But the next president, he didn't press buttons, he pressed palms. Repeatedly, relentlessly, on train platforms and dining cars, and across Amtrak terminals, because Joe Biden's truest legacy might just be his long-standing, deeply personal relationship with America's most overworked rail system. Joe Biden, before he was President Biden, before he was Vice President Biden, before he was even Joe from Scranton, he was something far less mythic, but somehow more American, a daily Amtrak commuter. For over 3 decades, Joe Biden rode the rails between Wilmington, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. Almost every day. Rain, snow, election years. It didn't matter. He took the train like it was part of his DNA, not just because it was practical, but because it grounded him. He knew the route. He knew the stops. But more importantly, he knew the people. Biden didn't just wave to conductors. He memorized their names. He asked about their kids. He sat with engineers in the quiet hours between stations and told stories that somehow blended legislative trivia with Irish Catholic guilt. They weren't just employees. They were friends. And when he finally became vice president and then president, Biden didn't forget them. He gave them challenge coins. Challenge coins are military-style tokens, engraved, personalized, symbolic. Presidents use them to honor service members, law enforcement, foreign dignitaries. It's a way of saying, you mattered to me. You were there. You're part of something. And Joe Biden gave them to Amtrak employees, conductors, engineers, ticket checkers, people who'd handed him coffee at 7 a.m., people who saw him when he was just another senator with a briefcase and a bad tie. He gave coins to honor their years of friendship, their shared routine, their role in a life lived between cities. This wasn't for press. This was ritual. One conductor told the story of receiving a coin directly from Biden's hand. Biden looked him in the eye and said, "You kept me on time longer than my staff ever could." The man kept the coin in his wallet for years. Still does. Why? Because in a world of photo ops, Biden's Amtrak loyalty wasn't performative. It was habit. It was comfort. It was grief, too. He began commuting daily after the tragic death of his wife and daughter in 1972, determined to be home for his surviving sons every night. That train ride became sacred, and every hand he shook on that platform became part of his story. So when people joke about Uncle Joe loving trains too much, when they tease his obsession with Amtrak like it's some quaint boomer fetish, they miss the point. This wasn't nostalgia, it was memory, motion, continuity, and the coins, they weren't awards. They were thank yous. Small, solid, glinting reminders that power doesn't just live in palaces, it lives in the spaces in between. In the men and women punching tickets, keeping time, carrying America quietly along its tracks.